General W.T. Sherman to his comrades in arms, volunteers, and regulars. Nearly 10 years have passed since the close of the Civil War in America, and yet no satisfactory history thereof is accessible to the public, nor should any attempted until the government has published and placed within the reach of students the abundant materials that are buried in the War Department at Washington. These are in process of compilation. But, at the rate of progress for the past 10 years, it is probable that a new century will come before they are published and circulated, with full indexes to enable the historian to make a judicious selection of materials. What is now offered is not designed as history of the war, or even as a complete account of all the incidents in which the writer bore a part, but merely his recollection of events, corrected by a reference to his own memoranda, which may assist the future historian when he comes to describe the whole, and account for the motives and reasons which influence some of the actors in the grand drama of war. I trust a perusal of these pages will prove interesting to the survivors, who have manifested so often their intense love of the cause, which moved a nation to vindicate its own authority, and equally so to the rising generation, who therefrom may learn that a country and government such as ours are worth fighting for, and dying for, if need be. If successful in this, I shall feel amply repaid for departing from the usage of military men, who seldom attempt to publish their own deeds, but rest content with simply contributing by their acts to the honor and glory of their country. William T. Sherman, General, St. Louis, Missouri, January 21st, 1875. The Memoirs of William Tecumseh Sherman. Preface to the second edition. Another 10 years have passed since I ventured to publish my memoirs, and being one more at leisure, I have revised them in the light of the many criticisms, public and private. My habit has been note to pencil the suggestions of critics, and to examine the substance of their differences. For critics may differ from the author, to manifest their superiority. Where I have found material error, I have corrected, and I have added 2 chapters, one at the beginning, another at the end, both of the most general character, and an appendix. I wish my friends and enemies to understand that I disclaim the character of historian, but assume to be a witness on the stand before the great tribunal of history, to assist some future Napier, Allison, or Hume, to comprehend the feelings and thoughts of the actors in the grand conflicts of the recent past, and thereby to lessen his labors in the compilation necessary for the future benefit of mankind. In this free country, every man is at perfect liberty to publish his own thoughts and impressions, and any witness who may differ from me should publish his own version of facts, in the truthful narration of which he is interested. I am publishing my own memoirs, not theirs. And we all know that no 3 honest witnesses of a simple brawl can agree on all the details. How much more likely will be the difference in a great battle covering a vast space of broken ground, when each division, brigade, regiment, and even company naturally and honestly believes that it was the focus of the whole affair. Each of them won the battle. None ever lost. That was the fate of the old man who unhappily commanded. In this edition, I give the best maps which I believe have ever been prepared, compiled by General O.M. Poe, from personal knowledge and official surveys, and what I chiefly aim to establish is the true cause of the results, which are already known to the whole world, and it may be a relief to many to know that I shall publish no other, but, like the player at cards, will stand. Not that I have accomplished perfection, but because I can do no better with the cards in hand. Of omissions there are plenty, but of willful perversion of the facts, none. In the preface of the first edition in 1875, I used the words, "Nearly 10 years have passed since the close of the Civil War in America, and yet no satisfactory history thereof is accessible to the public, nor should any be attempted until the government has published and placed within reaches of students the abundant materials that are buried in the War Department of Washington. These are in process of compilation, but at the rate of progress for the past 10 years, it is probable that a new century will come before they are published and circulated with full indexes to enable the historian to make a judicious selection of materials. Another decade has passed, and I am in possession of all these publications, my last being Volume 11, Part 3, Series 1, the last date in which is August 30th, 1862. I am afraid that if I assume again the character of prophet, I must extend the time deep into the next century, and pray meanwhile that the official records of the war, Union and Confederate, may approach completion before the next war, or rather that we, as a people, may be spared another war until the last one is officially recorded. Meantime, the rising generation must be content with memoirs and histories compiled from the best sources available. In this sense, I offer mine as to the events of which I was an eyewitness and participant, or for which I was responsible. William T. Sherman, General, retired. St. Louis, Missouri, March 30th, 1885. Chapter 1. From 1820 to the Mexican War, or 1820 to 1846. According to Cawthron in his History of Ancient Woodbury, Connecticut, the Sherman family came from Dedham, Essex County, England. The first recorded name is of Edmund Sherman, with his 3 sons, Edmund, Samuel, and John, who were at Boston before 1636. And further, it is distinctly recorded that Honorable Samuel Sherman, Reverend John, his brother, and Captain John, his first cousin, arrived from Dedham, Essex County, England, in 1634. Samuel afterward married Sarah Mitchell, who had come, in the same ship, from England, and finally settled at Stratford, Connecticut. The other 2 Johns located at Watertown, Massachusetts. From Captain John Sherman are descended Roger Sherman, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, Honorable William M. Evarts, the Misters Hoare of Massachusetts, and many others of national fame. Our own family are descended from the Honorable Samuel Sherman and his son, the Reverend John, who was born in 1650-51. Then another John, born 1687, then Judge Daniel, born in 1721, then Taylor Sherman, our grandfather, who was born in 1758. Taylor Sherman was a lawyer and a judge in Norwalk, Connecticut, where he resided until his death, May 4th, 1815, leaving a widow, Betsy Stoddard Sherman, and 3 children, Charles R., our father, Daniel, and Betsy. When the state of Connecticut in 1786 ceded to the United States her claim to the western part of her public domain, as defined by her royal charter, she reserved a large district in what is now northern Ohio, a portion of which, 500,000 acres, composed the Fireland District, which was set apart to indemnify the parties who had lost property in Connecticut by the raids of Generals Arnold, Tryon, and others during the latter part of the Revolutionary War. Our grandfather, Judge Taylor Sherman, was one of the commissioners appointed by the state of Connecticut to quiet the Indian title, and to survey and subdivide this Fireland District, which includes the present counties of Huron and Erie. In his capacity as commissioner, he made several trips to Ohio in the early part of this century, and it is supposed that he had then contracted the disease which proved fatal. For his labor and losses he received a title to 2 sections of land, which fact was probably the prime cause of the migration of our family to the West. My father received a good education and was admitted to the bar at Norwalk, Connecticut, where, in 1810, he, at 20 years of age, married Mary Hoyt, also of Norwalk, and at once migrated to Ohio, leaving his wife, my mother, for a time. His first purpose was to settle at Zanesville, Ohio, but he finally chose Lancaster, Fairfield County, where he at once engaged in the practice of his profession. In 1811 he returned to Norwalk, where, meantime, was born Charles Taylor Sherman, the eldest of the family, who, with his mother, was carried to Ohio on horseback. Judge Taylor Sherman's family remained in Norwalk till 1815, when his death led to the emigration of the remainder of the family, viz. our Uncle Daniel Sherman, who settled at Monroeville, Ohio, as a farmer, where he'd lived and died quite recently, leaving children and grandchildren, and an Aunt Betsy, who married Judge Parker of Mansfield and died in 1851, leaving children and grandchildren. Also grandmother Elizabeth Stoddard Sherman, who resided with her daughter, Mrs. Betsy Parker, in Mansfield until her death, August 1st, 1848. Thus my father, Charles R. Sherman, became finally established at Lancaster, Ohio, as a lawyer, with his own family in the year 1811, and continued there till the time of his death in 1829. I have no doubt that he was in the first instance attracted to Lancaster by the natural beauty of its scenery and the charms of its already established society. He continued in the practice of his profession, which in those days was no sinecure, for the ordinary circuit was made on horseback, and embraced Marietta, Cincinnati, and Detroit. Hardly was the family established there when the War of 1812 caused great alarm and distress in all Ohio. The English captured Detroit and the shores of Lake Erie down to the Maumee River, while the Indians still occupied the greater part of the state. Nearly every man had to be somewhat of a soldier, but I think my father was only a commissary. Still, he seems to have caught a fancy for the great chief of the Shawnees, Tecumseh. Perry's victory on Lake Erie was the turning point of the Western campaign, and General Harrison's victory over the British and Indians at the River Thames in Canada ended the war in the West, and restored peace and tranquility to the exposed settlers in Ohio. My father at once resumed his practice at the bar, and was soon reorganized as an able and successful lawyer. When, in 1816, my brother James was born, he insisted on engrafting the Indian name Tecumseh on the usual family list. My mother had already named her first son after her own brother Charles, and insisted on the second son taking the name of her other brother James, and when I came along on the 8th of February 1820, mother having no more brothers, my father succeeded in his original purpose, and named me William Tecumseh. The family rapidly increased till it embraced 6 boys and 5 girls, all of whom attained maturity and married. Of these 6 are still living. In the year 1821, a vacancy occurred in the Supreme Court of Ohio, and I find this petition. Somerset, Ohio, July 6, 1821. May it please your Excellency, we ask leave to recommend to your Excellency's favorable notice Charles R. Sherman, Esquire, of Lancaster, as a man possessing in an eminent degree those qualifications so much to be desired in a judge of the Supreme Court. From a long acquaintance with Mr. Sherman, we are happy to be able to state to your Excellency that our minds are led to the conclusion that that gentleman possesses a disposition noble and generous, a mind discriminating, comprehensive, and combining a heart pure, benevolent, and humane, manners dignified, mild, and complacent, and a firmness not to be shaken, and of unquestionable integrity. Well, Mr. Sherman's character cannot be unknown to your Excellency, but on the acquaintance, without further comment, we might safely rest his pretensions. We think we hazard little in assuring your Excellency that his appointment would be given almost universal satisfaction to the citizens of Perry County. With great consideration, we have the honor to be your Excellency's most obedient, humble servants. Signed, Charles A. Hood, George Treat, Peter Ditto, P. Audlin, J. B. Orton, T. Beckwith, William P. Dorst, John Murray, Jacob Mons, B. Eaton, Daniel Griggs, Henry Ditto, Nicholas McCarty. His Excellency Ethan A. Brown, Governor of Ohio, Columbus. He was soon after appointed a judge on the Supreme Court, and served in that capacity to the day of his death. My memory extends back to about 1827, and I recall him returning home on horseback, when all the boys used to run and contend for the privilege of riding his horse from the front door back to the stable. On one occasion I was the first, and being mounted rode to the stable, but old Dick was impatient because the stable door was not opened promptly, so he started for the barn of our neighbor Mr. King. There, also, no one was in waiting to open the gate, and, after a reasonable time, Dick started back for home somewhat in a hurry, and threw me among a pile of stones in front of Preacher Wright's house, where I was picked up apparently a dead boy, but my time was not yet, and I recovered, though the scars remain to this day. The year 1829 was a sad one to our family. We were then 10 children, my eldest brother Charles absent at State University, Athens, Ohio, my brother James in a store at Cincinnati, and the rest were at home at school. Father was away on the circuit. One day Jane Sturgeon came to the school, called us out, and when we reached home all was lamentation. News had come that our father was ill unto death at Lebanon, 100 miles away. Mother started at once, by coach, but met the news of his death about Washington. and returned home. He had ridden on horseback from Cincinnati to Lebanon to hold court, during a hot day in June. On the next day he took his seat on the bench, opened court in the forenoon, but in the afternoon, after recess, was seized with a severe chill, and had to adjourn the court. The best medical aid was called in, and for 3 days with apparent success, but the fever then assumed a more dangerous type, and he gradually yielded to it, dying on the 6th day, viz. June 24th, 1829. My brother James had been summoned from Cincinnati, and was present at his bedside, as was also Henry Stoddard, Esquire, of Dayton, Ohio, our cousin. Mr. Stoddard once told me that the cause of my father's death was cholera, but at the time, 1829, there was no Asiatic cholera in the United States, and the family attributed the death to exposure to the hot sun of June, and a consequent fever, typhoid. From the resolutions of the bench, bar, and public generally, now in my possession, his death was universally deplored, more especially by his neighbors in Lancaster and by the Society of Freemasons, of which he was the high priest of Arch Chapter No. 2. His death left the family very poor, but friends rose up with proffers of generous care and assistance, for all the neighbors knew what mother could not maintain so large a family without help. My eldest brother Charles had nearly completed his education at university at Athens, and concluded to go to his uncle, Judge Parker, at Mansfield, Ohio, to study law. My eldest sister Elizabeth soon after married William J. Reese, Esquire. James was already in his store at Cincinnati, and with the exception of the 3 youngest children, the rest of us were scattered. I fell to the charge of the Honorable Thomas Ewing, who took me to his family, and ever after treated me as his own son. I continued at the academy in Lancaster, which was the best in the place. Indeed, as good a school as any in Ohio. We studied all the common branches of knowledge, including Latin, Greek, and French. At first, the school was kept by Mr. Parsons. He was succeeded by Mr. Brown, and he by 2 brothers, Samuel and Mark Howe. These were all excellent teachers, and we made good progress, first at the old academy, and afterward at a new schoolhouse, built by Samuel Howe, in the orchard of Hugh Boyle, Esquire. Time passed with us, as with boys generally. Mr. Ewing was in the United States Senate, and I was notified to prepare for West Point, of which institution we had little knowledge except that it was very strict, and that the army was its natural consequence. In 1834 I was large for my age, and the construction of canals was the rage in Ohio. A canal was projected to connect with the great Ohio Canal at Carroll, 8 miles above Lancaster, down the valley of the Hockhocking to Athens, 44 miles, and then hence to the Ohio River by Slackwater. Preacher Carpenter, of Lancaster, was appointed to make the preliminary surveys, and selected the necessary working party out of the boys of the town. From our school were chosen Wilson, Emmanuel Giese, William King, and myself. Giese and I were the rodmen. We worked during the fall and next spring, marking 2 exceptional lines, and for our work we each received a silver $50 for each day's actual work, the first money any of us have ever earned. In June 1835, one of our school fellows, William Irvin, was appointed a cadet to West Point, and as it required 16 years of age for admission, I had to wait another year. During the autumn of 1835 and the spring of 1836, I devoted myself chiefly to mathematics and French, which were known to be chief requisites for admission to West Point. Sometime in the spring of 1836, I received through Mr. Ewing, then at Washington, from the Secretary of War, Mr. Poinsett, the letter of appointment as a cadet, with a list of the articles of clothing necessary to be taken along, all of which were liberally provided by Mrs. Ewing, and with orders to report to Mr. Ewing at Washington by a certain date. I left Lancaster about the 20th of May in the stagecoach for Zanesville. There we transferred to the coaches of the Great National Road, the highway of travel from west to the east. The stages generally traveled in gangs of from 1 to 6 coaches, each drawn by 4 good horses carrying 9 passengers inside and 3 or 4 outside. In about 3 days' traveling, day and night, we reached Frederick, Maryland. There we were told that we could take rail cars to Baltimore, and thence to Washington. But there was also a 2-horse hack ready to start for Washington direct. Not having full faith in the novel and dangerous railroad, I stuck to the coach, and in the night reached Gadsby's Hotel in Washington City. The next morning I hunted up Mr. Ewing, and found him boarding with a mess of senators at Mrs. Hill's corner on 3rd and C Streets, and transferred my trunk to the same place. I spent a week in Washington, and I think I saw more of that place in that time than I ever have since in the many years of residence there. General Jackson was president, and was the zenith of his fame. I recall looking at him at full hour one morning through the wood railing of Pennsylvania Avenue as he paced up and down the gravel walk on the north front of the White House. He wore a cap and an overcoat so full that his form seemed smaller than I had expected. I also recall the appearance of Postmaster General Amos Kendall, of Vice President Van Buren, Messrs. Calhoun, Webster, Clay, Cass, Silas Wright, etc. In due time, I took my departure for West Point with Cadets Belt and Brona. These were appointed cadets as from Ohio, although neither have ever seen that state. But in those days there were fewer applicants from Ohio than now, and near the close of the term, the vacancies unasked for were usually filled from applicants on the spot. Neither of these parties, however, graduated, so the state of Ohio lost nothing. There took a boat up to the Havre de Grace, then the rail to Wilmington, Delaware, and up the Delaware in a boat to Philadelphia. I stayed over in Philadelphia one day at the old mansion house to visit the family of my brother-in-law, Mr. Reese. I found his father a fine sample of the old merchant gentleman in a good house in Arch Street, with his accomplished daughters, who had been to Ohio, and whom I had seen there. From Philadelphia we took a boat to Bordentown, rail to the Amboy, and boat again to New York City, stopping at the American Hotel. I stayed a week in New York City, visiting my uncle Charles Hoyt at his beautiful place on Brooklyn Heights, and my uncle James, then living in White Street. My friend William Scott was there, the young husband of my cousin Louise Hoyt, who looked on me as an untamed animal just caught in the far west, fit food for gunpowder and good for nothing else. About June 12th I embarked on the steamer Cornelius Vanderbilt for West Point, registered in the office of Lieutenant C.F. Smith, adjutant of the Military Academy, as a new cadet on the class of 1836, and at once became installed as the plebe of many fellow townsmen, William Irvin, then entering his 3rd class. Colonel R.E. de Russy was superintendent. Major John Fowle, 6th United States Infantry, commanded. The principal professors were Mahan, engineering; Bartlett, natural philosophy; Bailey, chemistry; Church, mathematics; Weir, drawing; and Berard, French. The routine of military training and of instruction was then fully established, and has remained almost the same ever since. To give a mere outline would swell this to an inconvenient size, and I therefore merely state that I went through the regular course of 4 years, graduating in June 1840, number 6 in a class of 43. These 43 were all that remained of more than 100 which originally constituted the class. At the academy I was not considered a good soldier, for at no time I was selected for any office, but remained a private throughout the whole 4 years. Then, as now, neatness in dress and form, with a strict conformity to rules, were the qualifications required for office, and I suppose I was found not to excel in any of these. In studies I always held a respectable reputation with the professors, and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. In June 1840, after the final examination, the class graduated and we received our diplomas. Meantime, Major Delafield, United States Engineers, had become superintendent. Major C.F. Smith commanded of cadets, but the corps of professors and assistants remained almost unchanged during our whole term. We were all granted the usual furlough of 3 months and parted for our homes, there to await assignment to our respective corps and regiments. In due season, I was appointed and commissioned 2nd Lieutenant, 3rd Artillery, and ordered to report at Governor's Island, New York Harbor, at the end of September. I spent my furlough mostly at Lancaster and Mansfield, Ohio. Toward the close of the September, returned to New York, reported to Major Justin Dimmock, commanding the recruiting rendezvous at Governor's Island, and was assigned to command a company of recruits preparing for service in Florida. Early in October, this company was detailed as one of 4 to embark in a sailing vessel for Savannah, Georgia, under command of Captain and Brevet Major Penrose. We embarked and sailed, reaching Savannah about the middle of October, where we transferred to a small steamer and proceeded by the inland route to St. Augustine, Florida. We reached St. Augustine at the same time with the 8th Infantry, commanded by Colonel and Brevet Brigadier General William J. Worth. At that time, General Zachary Taylor was in chief command in Florida, and had his headquarters at Tampa Bay. My regiment, the 3rd Artillery, occupied the post along the Atlantic coast of Florida from St. Augustine south to Key Biscayne, and my own company, A, was at Fort Pierce, Indian River. At St. Augustine, I was detached from the company of recruits, which was designed for the 2nd Infantry, and was ordered to join my proper company at Fort Pierce. Colonel William Gates commanded the regiment, with Lieutenant William Austin Brown as an adjutant of the regiment. Lieutenant Bragg commanded the post of St. Augustine with his own company, E and G Gardeners, then commanded by Lieutenant Judd. In a few days I embarked in the little steamer William Gaston down the coast, stopping one day at New Smyrna, held by J.R. Vinton's company, B, with which was serving Lieutenant William H. Shover. In due season we arrived off the bar of Indian River and anchored. A whaleboat came off with a crew of 4 men, steered by a character of some note, known as the pilot Ashlock. I transferred self and baggage to this boat, and, with the mails, was carried through the surf over the bar into the mouth of the Indian River inlet. It was then dark. We transferred to a smaller boat, and the same crew pulled us up through a channel in the middle of mangrove islands, the roosting place of thousands of pelicans and birds that rose in clouds and circled above our heads. The water below was alive with fish, whose course through it could be seen by the phosphoric wake, and Ashlock told me many a tale of the Indian war then in progress, and of his adventures in hunting and fishing, which he described as the best in the world. About 2 miles from the bar we emerged into the lagoon, a broad expanse of shallow water that lies parallel with the coast, separated from it by a narrow strip of sand, backed by a continuous series of islands and promontories, covered with a dense growth of mangrove and saw palmetto. Pulling across this lagoon, in about 3 more miles, we approached the lights of Fort Pierce. Reaching a small wharf, we landed, and were met by the officers of the post, Lieutenant George Taylor and Edward J. Steptoe, and Assistant Surgeon James Simons. Taking the mail bag, we walked up a steep sand bluff, on which the fort was situated, and across the parade ground to the officers' quarters. These were 6 or 7 log houses, thatched with palmetto leaves, built on high posts with a porch in front, facing the water. The men's quarters were also of logs, forming the 2 sides of a rectangle, open towards the water. The intervals and the flanks were closed with log stockades. I was assigned to one of these rooms, and at once began service with my company, A, then commanded by Lieutenant Taylor. The season was hardly yet come for active operations against the Indians, so that the officers were naturally attracted to Ashlock, who was the best fisherman I ever saw. He soon initiated us into the mysteries of shark spearing, trolling for redfish, and taking the sheep's head and mullet. These abounded so that we could at any time catch an unlimited quantity at pleasure. The companies also owned nets for catching green turtles. These nets had meshes about a square foot, were set across channels in a lagoon, the ends secured to stakes driven into the mud, the lower line sunk with lead or stone weights, and the upper line floated with cork. We usually visited these nets twice a day, and found from 1 to 6 green turtles entangled in the meshes. Disengaging them, they were carried to pens, made with stakes stuck in the mud, where they were fed with mangrove leaves, and our cooks had at all times an ample supply of the best of green turtles. They were so cheap and common that the soldiers regarded it as an imposition when compelled to eat green turtle steaks, instead of poor Florida beef, or the usual barreled mess pork. I do not recall in my whole experience a spot on earth where fish, oysters, and green turtles so abound as at Fort Pierce, Florida. In November, Major Childs arrived with Lieutenant Van Vliet. and a detachment of recruits to fill our 2 companies, and preparations were at once begun for active operations in the field. At that time, the Indians in the peninsula of Florida were scattered, and the war consisted in hunting up and securing the small fragments to be sent to join the others of their tribe of Seminoles already established in the Indian Territory west of Arkansas. Our expeditions were mostly made in boats in the lagoons extending from the Hullover, near 200 miles above the fort, down to Jupiter Inlet, about 50 miles below, and in many streams which emptied therein. Many such expeditions were made during the winter, with more or less success, in which we succeeded in picking up small parties of men, women, and children. On one occasion near the Hullover, when I was not present, the expedition was more successful. It struck a party of nearly 50 Indians, killed several warriors, and captured others. In this expedition, my classmate, Lieutenant Van Villay, who was an excellent shot, killed a warrior who was running at full speed among the trees, and one of the sergeants of our company, Broderick, was said to have dispatched 3 warriors, and it was reported that he took the scalp of one and brought it into the fort as a trophy. Broderick was so elated that, on reaching the post, he had to celebrate his victory by a big drunk. There was, at the time, a poor, weakly soldier of our company whose wife cooked for our mess. She was somewhat of a flirt, and rather fond of admiration. Sergeant Broderick was attracted to her, and hung around the mess house more than the husband fancied, so he reported the matter to Lieutenant Taylor, who reproved Broderick for his behavior. A few days afterward, the husband again appealed to his commanding officer, Taylor, who exclaimed, "Haven't you got a musket? Can't you defend your own family?" Very soon after, a shot was heard down by the mess house, and it had transpired about the husband had actually shot Broderick, inflicting a wound which proved mortal. The law and army regulations required that the man should be sent to the nearest civil court, which was at St. Augustine. Accordingly, the prisoner and necessary witnesses were sent up by the next monthly steamer. Among the latter were Lieutenant Taylor and the pilot Ashlock. After they had gone about a month, the sentinel on the rooftop of our quarters reported the smoke of a steamer approaching the bar, and, as I was acting quartermaster, I took a boat and pulled down to get the mail. I reached the log hut in which the pilots lived, and saw them start with their boat across the bar, board and steamer, and then return. Ashlock was at his old post at the steering oar, with 2 ladies who soon came to the landing, having passed through a very heavy surf, and I was presented to one as Mrs. Ashlock, and the other as her sister, a very pretty Minorcan girl of about 14 years of age. Mrs. Ashlock herself was about 18 or 20 years old, and a very handsome woman. I was hurriedly informed that the murder trial was in progress at St. Augustine, that Ashlock had given his testimony, and had availed himself of the chance to take a wife to share with him in solitude of his desolate hut on the beach on the Indian River. He had brought ashore his wife, her sister, and their chests, with the mail, and had orders to return immediately to the steamer, Gaston or Harney, to bring ashore some soldiers belonging to another company, Bragg's, which had been ordered from St. Augustine to Fort Pierce. Ashlock left his wife and her sister standing on the beach near the pilot hut, and started back his whaleboat across the bar. I also took the mail and started up to the fort, and had hardly reached the wharf when I observed another boat following me. As soon as this reached the wharf, the men reported that Ashlock and all his crew, with the exception of one man, had been drowned a few minutes after I had left the beach. They said his surf boat had reached the steamer, had taken aboard a load of soldiers, some 8 or 10, and had started back through the surf when, on the bar, a heavy breaker upset the boat, and all were lost except the boy who pulled the bow oar, who clung to the rope or painter, hauled himself up to the upset boat, held on, drifted with it outside the breakers, and was finally beached near a mile down the coast. They reported also that the steamer had got up anchor, run in as close to the bar as she could, paused a while, and then had started down the coast. I instantly took a fresh crew of soldiers and returned to the bar. There sat poor Mrs. Whitlock on her chest of clothes, a weeping widow, who had seen her husband perish amid sharks and waves. She clung to the hope that the steamer had picked him up, but strange to say, he could not swim, although he had been employed on the water all of his life. Her sister was more demonstrative, and wailed as one lost to all hope and life. She appealed to us all to do miracles to save the struggling men in the waves, though 2 hours had already passed, and to have gone out then among those heavy breakers, with an experienced crew, would have been worse than suicide. All I could do was reorganize the guard at the beach, take the 2 desolate females up to the fort, and give them the use of my own quarters. Very soon their anguish quieted, and they began to look for the return of their steamer, with Ashlock and his rescued crew. The next day I went out again to the beach with Lieutenant Ord, and we found that 1 or 2 bodies had been washed ashore, torn all to pieces by the sharks, which literally swarmed the inlet at every new tide. In a few days the weather moderated, and the steamer returned from the south, but the surf was so high that she anchored a mile off. I went out myself, in the whale or surf boat, over that terrible bar with a crew of soldiers, boarded the steamer, and learned that none other of Ashlock's crew except the one before mentioned had been saved. But, on the contrary, the captain of the steamer had sent one of his own boats to their rescue, which was likewise upset in the surf, and, out of the 3 men in her, one had drifted back outside of the breakers, clinging to the upturned boat, and was picked up. This sad and fatal catastrophe made us all afraid of that bar, and in returning to the shore I adopted the more prudent course of beaching the boat below the inlet, which ensured a good ducking, but was attended with less risk to life. I had to return to the fort and bear Mrs. Ashlock the absolute truth, that her husband was lost forever. Meantime, her sister had entirely recovered her equilibrium, and being the guest of the officers, who were extremely courteous to her, she did not lament so loudly the calamity that saved them a long life of banishment on the beach of an Indian river. By the first opportunity they were sent back to St. Augustine, the possessors of all of Ashlock's worldly goods and effects, consisting of a good rifle, several cast nets, hand lines, etc., etc., besides some $300 in money, which was due to him by the quartermaster for his services as pilot. I afterward saw the ladies at St. Augustine, and years afterward the younger one came to Charleston, South Carolina, the wife of a somewhat famous Captain Thistle, agent for the United States for Live Oak in Florida, who was noted as the first of the troublesome class of inventors of modern artillery. He was the inventor of a gun that did not recoil at all, or, if anything, it recoiled a little forward. One day in the summer of 1841, the sentinel on the housetop at Fort Pierce called out, "Indians! Indians!" Everyone sprang to his gun. The companies formed promptly on the parade ground, and soon were reported as approaching the post. From the pine woods in rear, 4 Indians on horseback. They rode straight up to the gateway, dismounted, and came in. They were conducted by the officer of the day to the commanding officer, Major Childs, who sat on the porch in front of his own room. After the usual pause, one of them, a black man named Joe, who spoke English, said they had been sent in by Cocucci, Wildcat, one of the most noted of the Seminole chiefs, to see the big chief of the post. He gradually unwrapped a piece of paper, which was passed over to Major Childs, who read it, and it was in the nature of a safeguard for Wildcat to come into Fort Pierce to receive provisions and assistance while collecting his tribe with the purpose of emigrating to the reservation west of Arkansas. The paper was signed by General Worth, who had succeeded General Taylor at Tampa Bay, in command of all the troops in Florida. Major Childs inquired, "Where is Cocucci?" and was answered, "Close by," when Joe explained that he had been sent in by his chief to see if the paper was all right. Major Childs said it was all right, and that Cocucci ought to come himself. Joe offered to go out and bring him in, when Major Childs ordered me to take 8 or 10 mounted men and go out to escort him in. Detailing 10 men to saddle up and taking Joe and 1 Indian boy along on their own ponies, I started out under their guidance. We continued to ride for 5 or 6 miles when I began to suspect treachery, of which I had heard so much in former years and had been especially cautioned against by the older officers. But Joe always answered, "Only a little away." At last we approached one of those close hammocks, so well known in Florida, standing like an island in the interminable pine forest, with a pond of water near it. On its edge I noticed a few Indians loitering, which Joe pointed out as the place. Apprehensive of treachery, I halted the guard, gave order to the sergeant to watch me closely, and rode forward alone with the 2 Indian guides. As we neared the hammock, about a dozen Indian warriors rose up and waited for us. When in their midst I inquired for the chief Kokuchi. He approached my horse, and slapping his breast, said, "Me Kokuchi." He was a very handsome young Indian warrior, not more than 25 years old, but in his then dress could hardly be distinguished from the rest. I then explained to him through Joe that I had been sent by my chief to escort him into the fort. He wanted me to get down and talk. I told him that I had no talk in me, but that, on his reaching the post, he could talk as much as he pleased with the big chief, Major Childs. They all seemed to be indifferent and in no hurry, and I noticed all their guns were leaning against a tree. I beckoned to the sergeant, who advanced rapidly with his escort, and told him to secure the rifles, which he proceeded to do. Kokuchi pretended to be very angry, but I explained to him that his warriors were tired and mine were not, and that the soldiers would carry the guns on their horses. I told him I would provide him a horse to ride, and the sooner he was ready, the better for all. He then stripped, washed himself in the pond, and began to dress in all his Indian finery, which consisted of a buckskin leggings, moccasins, and several shirts. He then began to put on vests, one after another, and one of them had marks of a bullet, just above the pocket, with the stain of blood. In the pocket was a $1 Tallahassee banknote, and the rascal had the impudence to ask me to give him a silver coin for that dollar. He had evidently killed the wearer, and was disappointed because the pocket contained a paper dollar instead of one in silver. In due time he was dressed with turban and ostrich feathers, and mounted the horse reserved for him, and thus we rode back together to Fort Pierce. Major Childs and all the other officers received him on the porch, and there we had a regular talk. Kokuchi was tired of the war. His people were scattered, and it would take a moon to collect them for emigration, and he wanted rations for that time, etc., etc. All this was agreed to, and a month was allowed for him to get ready with his whole band, numbering some 150 or 160, to migrate. The talk then ceased, and Kokuchi and his envoys proceeded to get regularly drunk, which was easily done by the agency of commissary whiskey. They stayed at Fort Pierce during the night, and the next day departed. Several times during the month there came into the post 2 or more of the same Indians, always to beg for something to eat or drink. And after a full month, Kokuchi and about 20 of his warriors arrived with several ponies, but with none of their women and children. Major Childs had not from the beginning the least faith in his sincerity, had made up his mind to seize the whole party and compel them to emigrate. He arranged for the usual council, and instructed Lieutenant Taylor to invite Kokuchi and his uncle, who had held to be a principal chief, to his room to take some good brandy, instead of the common commissary whiskey. At a signal agreed on, I was to go about the quarters of Company A, to dispatch the first sergeant and another man to Lieutenant Taylor's room, there to seize the 2 chiefs and secure them, and with the company I was to enter Major Child's room and secure the remainder of the party. Meantime, Lieutenant Van Villay was ordered to go to the quarters of his Company F, and at the same signal to march rapidly to the rear of the officers' quarters, so as to catch any who might attempt to escape by the open windows to the rear. All resulted exactly as prearranged, and in a few minutes the whole party was in irons. At first they claimed that we had acted treacherously, but very soon they admitted that for a month Kokuchi had been quietly moving his women and children to Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades, and that this visit to our post was to have been their last. It so happened that almost at the instant of our seizing these Indians, a vessel arrived off the bar with reinforcements from St. Augustine. These were brought up to Fort Pierce, and we marched that night and next day rapidly, some 50 miles, to Lake Okeechobee, in hopes to capture the balance of the tribe, especially the families, but they had taken the alarm and escaped. Kokuchi and his warriors were sent by Major Childs in a schooner to New Orleans en route to their reservation, But General Worth had recalled them to Tampa Bay, and by sending out Kokuchi himself, the women and children came in voluntarily. And then all were shipped towards their destination. This was a heavy loss to the Seminoles, but there still remained in the peninsula a few hundred warriors with their families scattered into very small parcels, who were concealed in the most inaccessible hammocks and swamps. These had no difficulty in finding plenty of food anywhere and everywhere. Deer and wild turkey were abundant, and as for fish, there was no end to them. Indeed, Florida was the Indians' paradise, was of little value to us, and it was a great pity to remove the Seminoles at all, for we could have collected these Choctaws, Creeks, Cherokees, and Chickasaws in addition to the Seminoles. They would have thrived in the peninsula, whereas they now occupy lands that are very valuable, which are coveted by their white neighbors on all sides, while the peninsula of Florida still remains with a population less than should make a good state. During that and preceding years, General W.S. Harney had penetrated and crossed through the Everglades, capturing and hanging Chiquita and his band, and had brought in many prisoners who were also shipped west. We at Fort Pierce made several other excursions to Jupiter, Lake Worth, Lauderdale, and into the Everglades, picking up here and there a family, so that it was absurd any longer to call it a war. These excursions, however, possessed to us a peculiar charm, for the fragrance of the air, the abundance of game and fish, and just enough of adventure, gave to life a relish. I had just returned to Lauderdale from one of these scouts with Lieutenant Rankin, Ord, George H. Thomas, Field, Van Vliet, and others, when I received notice of my promotion to be First Lieutenant of Company G, which occurred November 30th, 1841, and I was ordered to return to Fort Pierce, turn over the public property for which I was accountable to Lieutenant H.S. Burton, and then to join my new company at St. Augustine. I reached St. Augustine before Christmas, and was assigned to command a detachment of 20 men stationed at Picolata, on the St. Johns River, 18 miles distant. As St. Augustine was still the headquarters of the regiment, Colonel William Gates with Company E, Lieutenant Bragg, and Company G, Lieutenant H.B. Judd, the only buildings at Picolata, were the one occupied by my detachment, which had been built for a hospital, and the dwelling of a family named Williams, with whom I boarded. On the other hand, St. Augustine had many pleasant families, among those whom was prominent United States Judge Bronson. I was half my time in St. Augustine or on the road, and remembered the old place with pleasure. In February we received orders transferring the whole regiment to the Gulf posts, and our company, G, was ordered to escort Colonel Gates and his family across the Suwannee River en route for Pensacola. The company, with the colonel and his family, reached Picolata, where my detachment joined, and we embarked in a steamboat for Pilitaka. Here Lieutenant Judd discovered that he had forgotten something and had to return to St. Augustine, so that I commanded the company on the march, having with me Second Lieutenant George B. Ayres. Our first march was to Fort Russell, then Micanopy, Wakahuta, and the Wacasees, all of which posts were garrisoned by the 2nd or 7th Infantry. At Wacasees we met General Worth and his staff, en route for Pilatka. Lieutenant Judd overtook us about the Suwannee, where we embarked on a small boat for Cedar Keys, and there took a larger one for Pensacola, where the colonel and his family landed, and our company proceeded on in the same vessel to our post, Fort Morgan, Mobile Point. The fort had not been occupied by troops for many years, was very dirty, and was found little or no stores there. Major Ogden, of the engineers, occupied a house outside the fort. I was quartermaster and commissary, and, taking advantage of one of the engineer's schooners, engaged in bringing materials for the fort. I went up to Mobile City, and, through the agency of the Messrs. Deschamps, Taylor, and Mayers, merchants, procured all essentials for the troops, and returned to the post. In the course of a week or 10 days arrived another company, H, commanded by Lieutenant James Ketchum and Lieutenants Rankin and Sewall L. Fish, and an assistant sergeant, Wells. Ketchum became the commanding officer and Lieutenant Rankin quartermaster. We proceeded to put the post in as good order as possible. I had regular guard mounting and parades, but little drill. We found magnificent fishing with the Seine on the outer beach, and sometimes in a single haul we would take 10 or 15 barrels of the best kind of fish, embracing pompanos, redfish, snappers, etc. We remained there till June, when the regiment was ordered to exchange from the Gulf posts to those of the Atlantic, extending from Savannah to North Carolina. The brig Wetumpka was chartered, and our company, G, embarked and sailed to Pensacola, where we took on board another company, D, Burke's, commanded by Lieutenant H.S. Burton, with Colonel Gates, the regimental headquarters, and some families. From Pensacola we sailed to Charleston, South Carolina. The weather was hot, the winds light, and we made long passage, but at last reached Charleston harbor, disembarked, and took post in Fort Moultrie. Soon after, 2 other companies arrived to Bragg's B and Keyes K. The 2 former companies were already quartered inside of Fort Moultrie, and these latter were placed in gun sheds outside, which were altered into barracks. We remained at Fort Moultrie nearly 5 years, until the Mexican War scattered us forever. Our life there was of strict garrison duty. We soon formed many and most pleasant acquaintances in the city of Charleston, and it so happened that many of the families resided at Sullivan's Island in the summer season, where we could reciprocate the hospitalities extended to us in the winter. During the summer of 1843, having been continuously on duty for 3 years, I applied for and received a leave of absence for 3 months, which I spent mostly in Ohio. In November I started to return to my post at Charleston by ways of New Orleans, took the stage to Chillicothe, Ohio, November 16th, having Henry Stanbury, Esquire, and wife as traveling companions. We continued by stage next day to Portsmouth, Ohio. At Portsmouth, Mr. Stanbury took a boat up the river, and I one down to Cincinnati. There I found my brothers Lamson and Hoyt employed in the Gazette printing office, and spent much time with them and Charles Anderson, Esquire, visiting his brother Lars, Mr. Longworth, some of his artist friends, and especially Miss Sale Carnell, then quite a belle, and noted for her fine voice. On the 20th I took passage on the steamboat Manhattan for St. Louis. Reached Louisville, where Dr. Conrad of the Army joined me, and in the Manhattan we continued on to St. Louis, with a mixed crowd. We reached the Mississippi at Cairo, the 23rd, and St. Louis Friday, November 24th, 1843. At St. Louis we called on Colonel S. W. Kearney and Major Cooper, his adjutant general, and found my classmate, Lieutenant McNutt, of the Ordnance, stationed at the arsenal, also Mr. Deas, an artist, and Pacificus Ord, who was studying law. I spent a week at St. Louis, visiting the arsenal, Jefferson Barracks, and most places of interest, and then became impressed with its great future. It then contained about 40,000 people, and my notes described 36 good steamboats receiving and discharging cargo at the levee. I took passage December 4th in the steamer John Ohl for New Orleans. As we passed Cairo, the snow was falling, and the country was wintry and devoid of verdure. Gradually, however, as we proceeded south, the green color came, grass and trees showed the change of latitude, and when in the course of a week we had reached New Orleans, the roses were in full bloom, the sugar cane just ripe, and a tropical air prevalent. We reached New Orleans December 11th, 1843, where I spent about a week visiting the barracks then occupied by the 7th Infantry, the theaters, hotels, and all the usual places of interest that day. On the 16th of December I continued on to Mobile in the steamer fashion by way of Lake Pontchartrain. Saw there most of my personal friends, Mr. and Mrs. Bull, Judge Bragg, and his brothers Dunbar, Deshawn, Taylor, and Myers, etc., and on the 19th of December took a passage in the steamer boat Bourbon for Montgomery, Alabama, by way of the Alabama River. We reached Montgomery at noon, December 23rd, and took cars at 1 p.m. for Franklin, 40 miles, which we reached at 7 p.m. Thence stages for Griffin, Georgia, via LaGrange and Greenville. This took the whole night of the 23rd and the day of the 24th. At Griffin we took cars for Macon, and thence to Savannah, which we reached Christmas night, finding Lieutenants Ridgely and Ketchum at tea, where we soon joined by Rankin and Beckwith. On the 26th, I took the boat for Charleston, reaching my post and reported for duty Wednesday morning, December 27, 1843. I had hardly got back to my post when, on the 21st of January, 1844, I received from Lieutenant R.P. Hammond at Marriott, Georgia, an intimation that Colonel Churchill, Inspector General of the Army, had applied for me to assist him in taking dispositions in Upper Georgia and Alabama concerning certain losses by volunteers in Florida of horses and equipment by reason of the failure of the United States to provide sufficient forage, and for which Congress had made appropriation. On the 4th of February, the order came from the Adjutant General in Washington for me to proceed to Marietta, Georgia, and report to Inspector General Churchill. I was delayed till the 14th of February by reason of being on a court-martial, when I was duly relieved and started to rail to Augusta, Georgia, and as far as Madison, where I took the mail coach, reaching Marietta on the 17th. There I reported for duty to Colonel Churchill, who was already engaged of his work, assisted by Lieutenant R.P. Hammond, 3rd Artillery, and a citizen named Stockton. The colonel had his family with him, consisting of Mrs. Churchill, Mary, now Mrs. Professor Baird, and Charles Churchill, then a boy of about 15 years of age. We all lived in a tavern and had an office convenient. The duty consisted in taking individual depositions of the officers and men who had composed 2 regiments and a battalion of mounted volunteers that had served in Florida. An oath was administered to each man by Colonel Churchill, who then turned the claimant over to one of us to take down and record his deposition according to certain forms, which enabled them to be consolidated and tabulated. We remained in Marietta about 6 weeks, during which time I repeatedly rode to Kennesaw Mountain and over the very ground where afterward, in 1864, we had some hard battles. After closing our business at Marietta, the colonel ordered us to transfer our operations to Bellefonte, Alabama. As he proposed to take his family and party by stage, Hammond lent me his riding horse, which I rode to Allatoona and the Etowah River. Hearing of certain large Indian mounds near the way, I turned to one side to visit them, stopping a couple of days with Colonel Lewis Tumlin, on whose plantation these mounds were. We struck up such an acquaintance that we corresponded for some years, and as I passed his plantation during the war in 1864, I inquired for him, but he was not at home. From Tumlin's I rode to Rome, and by way of Will's Valley over Sand Mountain and the Raccoon Range to the Tennessee River at Bellefonte, Alabama, we all assembled there in March and continued our works for nearly 2 months, when, having completed the business, Colonel Churchill with his family went north by way of Nashville, Hammond, Stockton, and I returning south on horseback by Rome, Allatoona, Marietta, Atlanta, and Madison, Georgia. Stockton stopped at Marietta, where he resided. Hammond took the cars at Madison, and I rode alone to Augusta, Georgia, where I left the horse and returned to Charleston and Fort Moultrie by rail. Thus, by a mere accident, I was enabled to traverse on horseback the very ground where in after years I had to conduct vast armies and fight great battles. That the knowledge thus acquired was of infinite use to me, and consequently to the government, I have always felt and stated. During the autumn of 1844, a difficulty arose among the officers of Company B, 3rd Artillery, John R. Vinton's, garrisoning Augusta Arsenal, and I was sent up from Fort Moultrie as a sort of peacemaker. After staying there some months, certain transfers of officers were made, and I returned to my post, Fort Moultrie. During that winter, 1844-45, I was visiting at the plantation of Mr. Poyas, on the east branch of the Cooper, about 50 miles from Fort Moultrie, hunting deer with his son James and Lieutenant John F. Reynolds, 3rd Artillery. We had taken our stands, and a deer came out of the swamp near that of Mr. James Poyas, who fired, broke the leg of the deer, which turned into the swamp and came out again above mine. I could follow his course by the cry of the hounds, which were in close pursuit. Hastily mounting my horse, I struck across the pine woods to head the deer off, and when at full career my horse leaped a fallen log, and his forefoot caught one of those hard, unyielding pine knots had brought him with violence to the ground. I got up as quick as possible and found my right arm out of place of the shoulder, caused by the weight of the double-barreled gun. Seeing Reynolds at some distance, I called out lustily and brought him to me. He soon mended the bridle and saddle, which had been broken by the fall, helped me on my horse, and we followed the course of the hounds. At first my arm did not pain me much, but it soon began to ache, so that it was almost unendurable. In about 3 miles we came to the negro hut, where I got off and rested till Reynolds could overtake Poyas and bring him back. They came at last, but by the time the arm was so swollen and painful that I could not ride. They rigged up an old gig belonging to the negro, in which I was carried 6 miles to the plantation of Mr. Poyas, Sr. A neighboring physician was sent for me, who tried the usual method of setting the arm, but without success, each time making the operation more painful. At last he sent off, got a set of double pulleys and cords, with which he succeeded in extending the muscles in getting the bone into place. I have returned to Fort Moultrie, but being disabled, applied for short leave and went north. I started January 25th, 1845, went to Washington, Baltimore, and Lancaster, Ohio, whence I went to Mansfield, and thence back to Newark, to Wheeling, Cumberland, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, whence I sailed back for Charleston on the ship Sullivan, reaching Fort Moultrie March 9th, 1845. About that time, March 1st, 1845, Congress had, by joint resolution, provided for the annexation of Texas, then an independent republic, subject to certain conditions requiring the acceptance of the Republic of Texas to be final and conclusive. We all expected war as a matter of course. At that time, General Zachary Taylor had assembled a couple of regiments of infantry and one of dragoons at Fort Jessup, Louisiana, and had orders to extend military protection to Texas against Indians or a foreign enemy, the moment the terms of annexation were accepted. He received notice of such acceptance July 7th, and forthwith proceeded to remove his troops to Corpus Christi, Texas, where during the summer and fall of 1845 was assembled the sense with which in spring of 1846 was begun the Mexican War. Sometime during the summer came to Fort Moultrie orders for sending Company E, 3rd Artillery, Lieutenant Bragg, to New Orleans, there to receive a battery of field guns, and thence to the camp of General Taylor at Corpus Christi. This was the first company of our regiment sent to the seat of war, and it embarked on the brig Hayne. This was the only company that left Fort Moultrie till after I was detached for recruiting service on the 1st of May, 1846. Inasmuch as Charleston afterward became famous as the spot where began our Civil War, a general description of it, as it was in 1846, will not be out of place. The city lies on a long peninsula between the Ashley and Cooper rivers, a low, level peninsula of sand. Meeting Street is its Broadway, with King Street next west and parallel, the street of shops and small stores. These streets are crossed at right angles by many others, of which Broad Street was the principal, and the intersection of Meeting and Broad was the heart of the city, marked by the guardhouse and St. Michael's Episcopalian Church. The custom house, post office, etc., were at the foot of Broad Street, near the wharves of the Cooper River front. At the extremity of the peninsula was a drive, open to the bay, and faced by some of the handsomest houses of that city, called the Battery. Looking down the bay on the right was James Island, an irregular triangle of about 7 miles, the whole island in cultivation with Sea Island cotton. At the lower end was Fort Johnson, then simply the station of Captain Bowman, United States Engineers, engaged in building Fort Sumter. This fort, Sumter, was erected on an artificial island nearly in mid-channel, made by dumping rocks, mostly brought as ballast in cotton ships from the north. As the rocks reached the surface it was leveled, and made the foundation of Fort Sumter. In 1846 this fort was barely above the water. Still farther out beyond James Island, and separated from it with a wide space of salt marsh, with crooked channels, was Morris Island, composed of the sand dunes thrown up by the wind and the sea, backed with the salt marsh. Of this was the lighthouse, but no people. On the left, looking down the bay from the battery of Charleston was first Castle Pinckney, a round brick fort of 2 tiers of guns, one in embrasure, the other in barbette, built on a marsh island which was not garrisoned. Farther down the bay, a point of the mainland reached the bay, where there was a group of houses called Mount Pleasant, and at extremity of the bay, distant 6 miles, was Sullivan's Island, presently a smooth sand beach to the sea, with the line of sand hills or dunes thrown up by the waves and winds, and the usual backing of marsh and crooked saltwater channels. At the shoulder of this island was Fort Moultrie, an irregular fort without ditch or counterscarp, with a brick scarp wall about 12 feet high, which could be scaled anywhere, and this was surmounted by an earth parapet capable of mounting about 40 24 and 32-pounder smooth-bore iron guns. Inside the fort were 3 two-story brick barracks, sufficient to quarter the officers and the men of 2 companies of artillery. At sea was the usual bar, changing slightly from year to year, but generally the main ship channel came from the south, parallel to Morris Island, till it was well up to Fort Moultrie, where it curved, passing close to Fort Sumter and up the wharves of the city, which were built mostly along the Cooper River front. Charleston was then a proud, aristocratic city, and assumed a leadership in the public opinion of the South far out of proportion to her population, wealth, and commerce. On more than one occasion previously, the inhabitants had almost inaugurated civil war by their assertion and professed belief that each state had, in original compact of government, reserved to itself the right to withdraw from the Union at its own option, whenever the people supposed by they had sufficient cause. We used to discuss these things at our own mess tables, vehemently and sometimes quite angrily, but I am sure that I never feared it would go further than it had already gone in the winter of 1832-33, when the attempt at nullification was promptly suppressed by President Jackson's famous declaration, "The Union must and shall be preserved," and by judicious management of General Scott. Still, civil war was to be, and, now that it has come and gone, we can rest secure in the knowledge that as the chief cause, slavery, had been eradicated forever, it is not likely to come again. Chapter 2. Early Recollections of California, 1846 to 1848. In the spring of 1846, I was a first lieutenant of Company G, 3rd Artillery, stationed at Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. The company was commanded by Captain Robert Anderson. Henry B. Judd was the senior first lieutenant, and I was the junior first lieutenant, and George B. Ayers the second lieutenant. Colonel William Gates commanded the post and regiment, with First Lieutenant William Austin as his adjutant. 2 other companies were at the post, viz. Martin Burks and E.D. Keyes, and among the officers were T.W. Sherman, Morris Miller, H.B. Field, William Churchill, Joseph Stewart, and Surgeon McLaren. The country known now as Texas had been recently acquired, and war with Mexico was threatening. One of our companies, Bragg's, with George H. Thomas, John F. Reynolds, and Frank Thomas, had gone the year previous and was at that time with General Taylor's army at Corpus Christi, Texas. In that year, 1846, I received the regular detail for recruiting service, with orders to report to the General Superintendent at Governor's Island, New York, and accordingly left Fort Moultrie in the later part of April, and reported to the Superintendent, Colonel R.B. Mason, 1st Dragoons, at New York on the 1st day of May. I was assigned to the Pittsburgh rendezvous, whither I proceeded and relieved Lieutenant Scott. Early in May, I took up my quarters at St. Charles Hotel, and entered upon the discharge of my duties. There was a regular recruiting station, already established, with a sergeant, corporal, and 2 or 3 men, with a citizen physician, Dr. McDowell, to examine the recruits. The threatening war with Mexico made a demand for recruits, and I received authority to open another sub-rendezvous at Zanesville, Ohio, whither I took the sergeant and established him. This was very handy to me, as my home was at Lancaster, Ohio, only 36 miles off, so that I was thus enabled to visit my friends there quite often. In the latter part of May, when at Wheeling, Virginia, on my way back from Zanesville to Pittsburgh, I heard the first news of the Battle of Palo Alto and Reesca de la Palma, which occurred on the 8th and 9th of May, and, in common with everybody else, felt intensely excited. That I should be on recruiting service when my comrades were actually fighting was intolerable, and I hurried on to my post, Pittsburgh. At that time, the railroad did not extend west of the Alleghenies, and all journeys were made by stagecoaches. In this instance, I was traveled from Zanesville to Wheeling, thence to Washington, Pennsylvania, and thence to Pittsburgh by stagecoach. On reaching Pittsburgh, I found many private letters, one from Ord, then a first lieutenant in Company F, 3rd Artillery, at Fort McHenry, Baltimore, saying that his company had just received orders from California and asking me to apply for it. Without committing myself to that project, I wrote to the Adjutant General R. Jones at Washington, D.C., asking him to consider me as an applicant for any active service, and saying that I would willingly forego the recruiting detail, which I well knew plenty of others would jump at. Impatient to approach the scene of active operations without authority, and I suppose wrongfully, I left my corporal in charge of the rendezvous, and took all the recruits I had made, about 25, in a steamboat to Cincinnati, and turned them over to Major N.C. McCrae, commanding at Newport Barracks. I then reported in Cincinnati to the superintendent of the Western Recruiting Service, Colonel Fanning, an old officer with one arm, who inquired by what authority I had come away from my post. I argued that I took it for granted he wanted all the recruits he could get forward to the army at Brownsville, Texas, and did not know but that he might want me to go along. Instead of appreciating my volunteer zeal, he cursed and swore at me for leaving my post without orders, and told me to go back to Pittsburgh. I then asked for an order that would entitle me to transportation back, which at first he emphatically refused. But at last he gave the order, and I returned to Pittsburgh, all the way by stage, stopping again at Lancaster, where I attended the wedding of my schoolmate Mike Effinger, and also visited my sub-rendezvous at Zanesville. R.S. Ewell, of my class, arrived to open a cavalry rendezvous, but finding my depot there, he went on to Columbus, Ohio. Tom Jordan afterward was ordered to Zanesville to take charge of that rendezvous, under the General War Department orders increasing the number of recruiting stations. I reached Pittsburgh late in June, and found the order relieving me from recruiting service, and detailing my classmate H.B. Field to my place. I assigned to Company F, then under orders for California. By private letters from Lieutenant Ord, I heard that the company had already started from Fort McHenry to the Governor's Island, New York Harbor, to take passage for California in a naval transport. I worked all that night, made up my accounts current, and turned over the balance of cash to the citizen physician, Dr. McDougal, and also closed my clothing and property returns, leaving blank receipts with the same gentleman for Fields' signature when he should get there, to be forwarded to the department at Washington, and the duplicates to me. These I did not receive for more than a year. I remember that I got my orders at 8 p.m. one night, and took passage in the boat for Brownsville. The next morning traveled by stage from Brownsville to Cumberland, Maryland, and thence by cars to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, in a great hurry lest the ship might sail without me. I found Company F at Governor's Island, Captain C.Q. Tompkins in command, Lieutenant E.O.C. Ord, Senior First Lieutenant, myself Junior First Lieutenant, Lucian Loser, and Charles Minor, the Second Lieutenants. The company had been filled up to 100 privates, 12 non-commissioned officers, and 1 ordnance sergeant, Layton, making 113 enlisted men and 5 officers. Dr. James L. Ord had been employed as an acting surgeon to accompany the expedition, and Lieutenant H.W. Halleck of the Engineers was also to go along. The United States store ship Lexington was then preparing at the Naval Yard, Brooklyn, to carry us from Cape Horn to California. She was receiving on board the necessary stores for the long voyage, and for service after our arrival there. Lieutenant Commander Theodorus Bailey was in command of the vessel, Lieutenant William H. McComb, executive officer, and past midshipmen Muse, Spots, and J.W.A. Nicholson were the watch officers, Wilson pursuer, and Abernathy surgeon. The latter was a caterer of the mess, and we all made an advance of cash for him to lay in the necessary mess stores, to enable us to prepare for so long a voyage, and for an indefinite sojourn in that far-off country. The War Department had authorized us to draw 6 months' pay in advance, which sum of money we invested in surplus clothing, and such other things seemed to us necessary. At last the ship was ready, and was towed down abreast of Fort Columbus, where we were conveyed on board, and on the 14th of July, 1846, we were towed to sea by a steam tug and cast off. Colonel R.B. Mason, still superintendent of the General Recruiting Service, accompanied us down the bay and out to sea, returning with the tug. A few other friends were of the party, but at last they left us, and we were alone upon the sea, and the sailors were busy with the sails and ropes. The Lexington was an old ship, changed from a sloop of war to a store-ship, with an after cabin, a wardroom, and between decks. In the cabin were Captains Bailey and Tompkins, with whom messed the purser, Wilson. In the wardroom were all the other officers, 2 in each stateroom, and Minor, being an extra lieutenant, had to sleep in a hammock slung in the wardroom. Ord and I roomed together. Halleck and Lozer and the others were scattered about. The men were arranged in bunks between decks, one set along the sides of the ship and another double-tier amidships. The crew were slung in hammocks well forward. Of these there were about 50. We at once subdivided the company into 4 squads, under the 4 lieutenants of the company, and arranged with the naval officers that our men should serve on deck by squads, after the manner of their watches, that the sailors should do all the work aloft, and the soldiers on deck. On fair days we drilled our men at the manual, and generally kept them employed as much as possible, giving great attention to the police and cleanliness of their dress and bunks. And so successful were we in this, that, though the voyage lasted nearly 200 days, every man was able to leave ship and march up the hill to the fort at Monterey, California, carrying his own knapsack and equipments. The voyage from New York to Rio Janeiro was without accident or anything to vary the usual monotony. We soon settled down to the humdrum of a long voyage, reading some, not much, playing games but never gambling, and chiefly engaged in eating our meals regularly. In crossing the equator, we had the usual visit of Neptune and his wife, who, with a large razor and a bucket of soapsuds, came over the sides and shaved some of the greenhorns. But naval etiquette exempted the officers, and Neptune was not permitted to come aft of the mizzenmasts. At last, after 60 days of absolute monotony, the island of Raza, off Rio Janeiro, was descried, and we slowly entered the harbor, passing a fort on our right hand, from which came a hail, in the Portuguese language, from a large speaking trumpet, and our officer of the deck answered back in gibberish, according to a well-understood custom of the place. Sugarloaf Mountain, on the south of the entrance, is very remarkable and well named. It is almost conical, with a slight lean. The man-of-war anchorage is about 5 miles inside the heads, directly in front of the city of Rio Janeiro. Words will not describe the beauty of this perfect harbor, nor the delightful feeling after a long voyage of its fragrant airs, and the entire constant between all things there and what we had left in New York. We found the United States frigate Columbia anchored there, and, after the Lexington was properly moored, nearly all the officers went on shore for sightseeing and enjoyment. We landed at a wharf opposite which was a famous French restaurant, Faro, and after ordering supper we all proceeded to the Rua de Avador, where most of the shops were, especially those for making feather flowers, as much to see the pretty girls as the flowers which they so skilfully made. Thence we went to the theatre, where, besides some opera, we witnessed the audience and saw the Emperor Dom Pedro, and his Empress, the daughter of the King of Sicily. After the theatre we went back to the restaurant, where we had an excellent supper, with fruits of every variety and excellence, such as we had never seen before, or even knew the names of. Supper being over, we called for the bill, and it was rendered in French, with Brazilian currency. It footed up some 26,000 reais. The figures alarmed us, so we all put on the waiter's plate various coins in gold, which he took to the counter and returned the change, making the total about $16. The milrei is about $1, but being a paper money, was at a discount, so as only to be worth about 56-cent coin. The Lexington remained in Rio about a week, during which we visited the palace, a few miles in the country, also the Botanic Gardens, a place of infinite interest, with its specimens of tropical fruits, spices, etc., etc., and indeed every place of note. The thing I best recall is a visit Halleck and I made to the Corcovado, a high mountain whence the water is conveyed for the supply of the city. We started to take a walk, and passed along the aqueduct, which approaches the city by a series of arches, thence up the point of a hill to a place known as the Madre, or fountain, to which all the water that drips from the leaves is conducted by the tile gutters and is carried to the city by an open stone aqueduct. Here we found Mr. Henry A. Wise of Virginia, the United States Minister to Brazil, and a Dr. Garnett, United States Navy, his intended son-in-law. We had a very interesting conversation in which Mr. Wise enlarged on the fact that Rio was supplied from the dews of heaven, for in the dry season the water comes from the mists and fogs which hang around the Corcovado, drips from the leaves of the trees, and is conducted to the Madre fountain by miles of tile gutters. Halleck and I continued our ascent of the mountain, catching from points of the way magnificent views of the scenery round about Rio Janeiro. We reached near the summit what was called the Emperor's Coffee Plantation, where we saw coffee berries in their various stages, and the scaffolds on which the berries were dried before being cleaned. The coffee tree reminded me of the red haw tree of Ohio, and the berries were somewhat like those of the same tree, 2 grains of coffee being enclosed in one berry. These were dried and cleaned of the husk by hand or by machinery. A short, steep ascent from this place carried us to the summit, from which is beheld one of the most picturesque views on earth. The Oregon Mountains to the west and north, the ocean to the east, the city of Rio with its red-tiled houses at our feet, and the entire harbor like a map spread out, with innumerable bright valleys, make up a landscape that cannot be described by mere words. This spot is universally visited by strangers, and has often been described after enjoying it immeasurably. We returned to the city by another route, tired but amply repaid by our long walk. In due time all had been done that was requisite, and the Lexington put to sea and resumed her voyage. In October we approached Cape Horn. The first land descried was Staten Island, white with snow, and the ship seemed to be aiming for the channel to its west, Straits of Le Maire. But her course was changed, and we passed around to the east. In time we saw Cape Horn, an island rounded like an oven, after which it takes its name, Hornos, oven. Here we experienced very rough weather, buffering about under storm staysails, and spending nearly a month before the wind favored our passage and enabled the course of the ship to be changed for Valparaiso. One day we sailed parallel with a French sloop of war, and it was sublime to watch the 2 ships rising and falling in those long, deep swells of the ocean. All the time we were followed by the usual large flocks of Cape pigeons and albatrosses of every color. The former resembled the common barn pigeons exactly, but are in fact gulls of beautiful and varied colors, mostly dove color. We caught many with fishing lines baited with pork. We also took in the same way many albatrosses. The white ones are very large, and their down is equal to that of the swan. At last Cape Horn and its swelling seas were left behind, and we reached Valparaiso in about 60 days from Rio. We anchored in the open roadstead, and spent there about 10 days visiting the usual places of interest. In foretop, maintop, mizzentop, etc., Halleck and Ord went up to Santiago, the capital of Chile, some 60 miles inland, but I did not go. Valparaiso did not impress me favorably at all. Seen from the sea, it looked like a long string of houses along the narrow beach, surmounted with red banks of earth, with little verdure, and no trees at all. Northward, the space widened out somewhat, and gave room for a plaza, but the mass of houses in that quarter were poor. We were there in November, corresponding to our early spring, and we enjoyed the large strawberries which abounded. The Independence frigate, Commodore Shubrick, came in while we were there, having overtaken us, bound also for California. We met there also the sloop of war Levant, from California, and from the officers heard of many of the events that had transpired about the time the Navy, under Commodore Sloat, had taken possession of the country. All the necessary supplies being renewed in Valparaiso, the voyage was resumed. For nearly 40 days we had uninterrupted favorable winds, being in the trades, and, having settled down to sailor habits, time passed without notice. We had brought with us all books we could find in New York and California, and had read them over and over again, Wilkes's Exploring Expedition, Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast, and Forbes's Account of the Missions. It was generally understood we were bound for Monterey, then the capital of Upper California. We knew, of course, that General Kearny was en route for the same country overland, that Fremont was there with his exploring party, that the Navy had already taken possession, and that a regiment of volunteers, Stevenson's, was to follow us from New York. But nevertheless we were impatient to reach our destination. About the middle of January the ship began to approach the California coast, of which the captain was duly cautious, because the English and Spanish charts differed some 15 miles in the longitude, and on all the charts a current of 2 miles an hour was indicated northward along the coast. At last land was made one morning, and here occurred one of those accidents so provoking after a long and tedious voyage. Macomb, the master and regular navigator, had made the correct observations, but Nicholson during the night, by an observation on the North Star, put the ship some 20 miles farther south than was the case by the regular reckoning, so that Captain Bailey gave directions to alter the course of the ship more to the north, and to follow the coast up, and to keep a good lookout for Point Pinos, that marks the location of Monterey Bay. The usual north wind slackened, so that when noon allowed Macomb to get a good observation, it was found that we were north of Año Nuevo, the northern headland of Monterey Bay. The ship was put about, but little by little arose one of those southeast storms so common on the coast in winter, and we buffeted about for several days, cursing that unfortunate observation of the North Star, for, on first sighting the coast, had we turned for Monterey, instead of away to the north, we would have been snugly anchored before the storm. But the southeaster abated, and the usual northwest wind came out again, and we sailed steadily down into the roadstead of Monterey Bay. This is shaped somewhat like a fishhook, the bar being the harbor, the point being Point Pinos, the south the southern headland. Slowly the land came out of the storm, the high mountains about Santa Cruz, the low beach of the Salinas, and the strongly marked ridge terminating in the sea in a point of dark pine trees. Then the line of whitewashed houses of adobe, backed by the groves of dark oaks resembling old apple trees, and then we saw 2 vessels anchored close to the town. One was a small merchant brig, and another a large ship apparently dismasted. At last we saw a boat coming out to meet us, and when it came alongside, we were surprised to find Lieutenant Henry Wise, master of the Independence frigate, that we had left at Valparaiso. Wise had come off to pilot us to our anchorage. While giving orders to the man at the wheel, he, in his peculiar fluent style, told to us, gathered about him, that the Independence had sailed from Valparaiso a week after us and had been in Monterey a week, that the Californians had broken out into an insurrection, that the naval fleet under Commodore Stockton was all down the coast about San Diego, that General Kearny had reached the country, but had had a severe battle at San Pasqual, and had been worsted, losing several officers and men, himself and others wounded, that war was then going on at Los Angeles, that the whole country was full of guerrillas, and that recently at Yerba Buena the alcalde, Lieutenant Bartlett, United States Navy, while out after cattle, had been lassoed, etc., etc. Indeed, in the short space of time that Wise was piloting our ship in, he told us more news than we could have learned on shore in a week, and, being unfamiliar with the great distances, we imagined that we should have to debark and begin fighting at once. Swords were brought out, guns oiled and made ready, and everything was in a bustle when the old Lexington dropped her anchor on January 26, 1847, in Monterey Bay after a voyage of 198 days from New York. Everything on shore looked bright and beautiful, the hills covered with grass and flowers, the live oaks so serene and homelike, and the low adobe houses with red-tiled roofs and whitened walls, contrasted well with the dark pine trees behind, making a decidedly good impression upon us who had come so far to spy out the land. Nothing could be more peaceful in its looks than Monterey in January 1847. We had already made the acquaintance of Commodore Shubrick and the officers of the Independence in Valparaiso, so that we again met as old friends. Immediate preparations were made for landing, and, as I was quartermaster and commissary, I had plenty to do. There was a small wharf and an adobe custom house in possession of the Navy, also a barrack of 2 stories occupied by some Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Maddox, and on a hill to the west of the town had been built a 2-story blockhouse of hewed logs occupied by a guard of sailors under command of Lieutenant Baldwin, United States Navy. Not a single modern wagon or cart was to be had in Monterey, nothing but the old Mexican cart with wooden wheels, drawn by 2 or 3 pairs of oxen, yoked by the horns. A man named Tom Cole had 2 or more of these, and he came into immediate requisition. The United States Consul, and most prominent man there at the time, was Thomas O. Larkin, who had a store and a pretty good 2-story house occupied by his family. It was soon determined that our company was to land and encamp on the hill at the blockhouse, and we were also to have possession of the warehouse, or custom house, for storage. The company was landed on the wharf, and we all marched in full dress with knapsacks and arms, to the hill and relieved the guard under Lieutenant Baldwin. Tents and camp equipage were hauled up, and soon the camp was established. I remained in a room at the custom house, where I could superintend the landing of the stores and their proper distribution. I had brought out from New York $20,000 commissary funds and $8,000 quartermaster funds, and as the ship contained about 6 months' supply of provisions, also a sawmill, gristmill, and almost everything needed, we were soon established comfortably. We found that the people of Monterey, a mixed set of Americans, native Mexicans, and Indians, about 1,000 all told. They were kind and pleasant, and seemed to have nothing to do, except such as owned ranches in the country for the rearing of horses and cattle. Horses could be bought at any price from $4 up to $16, but no horse was ever valued above a doubloon or Mexican ounce, $16. Cattle cost $8.50 for the best, and this made beef net about 2 cents a pound, but at that time nobody bought beef by the pound, but by the carcass. Game of all kinds, elk, deer, wild geese, and ducks were as abundant, but coffee, sugar, and small stores were rare and costly. There were some half-dozen shops or stores, but their shelves were empty. The people were very fond of riding, dancing, and of shows of any kind. The young fellows took great delight in showing off their horsemanship, and would dash along, picking up a $50 from the ground, stop their horses in full career, and turn about on the space of a bullock's hide. And their skill with the lasso was certainly wonderful. At full speed they could cast their lasso about the horns of a bull, or so throw it as to catch any particular foot. These fellows would work all day on horseback in driving cattle or catching wild horses, for a mere nothing, but all the money offered would not have hired one of them to walk a mile. The girls were very fond of dancing, and they did dance gracefully and well. Every Sunday, regularly, we had a baile, or dance, and sometimes interspersed through the week. I remember very well, soon after our arrival, that we were all invited to witness a play called Adam and Eve. Eve was personated by a pretty young girl known as Dolores Gomez, who, however, was dressed very unlike Eve, for she was covered with a petticoat and spangles. Adam was personated by her brother, the same who has since become somewhat famous as the person on whom is founded the McGarren claim. God Almighty was personated, and heaven's occupants seemed very human. Yet the play was pretty, interesting, and elicited universal applause. All the month of February we were by day preparing for our long stay in the country, and at night making the most of the balls and parties of the most primitive kind, picking up a smattering of Spanish, and extending our acquaintance with the people and the costumbres del país. I can well recall that Ord and I, impatient to look inland, got permission and started for the mission of San Juan Bautista. Mounted on horses, and with our carbines, we took the road by El Toro, quite a prominent hill, around which passes the road to the south, following the Salinas or Monterey River. After about 20 miles over a sandy country covered with oak bushes and scrub, we entered quite a pretty valley in which there was a ranch at the foot of the Toro. Resting there a while and getting some information, we again started in the direction of a mountain to the north of the Salinas, called the Gavillano. It was quite dark when we reached the Salinas River, which we attempted to pass at several points but found it full of water, and the quicksands were bad. Hearing the bark of a dog, we changed our course in that direction, and, on hailing, we were answered by voices which directed us where to cross. Our knowledge of the language was limited, but we managed to understand and to flounder through the sand and water, and reached a small adobe house on the banks of the Salinas, where we spent the night. The house was a single room, without floor or grass, only a rude door, and a window with bars. Not a particle of food but meat, yet the man and woman entertained us with the language of lords. put themselves, their house, and everything at our disposition, and made little barefoot children dance for our entertainment. We made our supper of beef, and slept on a bullock's hide on the dirt floor. In the morning we crossed the Salinas Plain, about 15 miles of level ground, taking a shot occasionally at wild geese, which abounded there, and entering the well-wooded valley that comes out from the foot of the Gavellano. We had cruised about all day, and it was almost dark when we reached the house of Señor Gomez, father of those who at Monterey had performed the parts of Adam and Eve. His house was a 2-story adobe, and had a fence in front. It was situated well up among the foothills of the Gavellano, and could not be seen until within a few yards. We hitched our horses to the fence, and went in just as Gomez was about to sit down to a tempting supper of stewed hare and tortillas. We were officers and caballeros, and could not be ignored. After turning our horses to grass, at his invitation we joined him at supper. The allowance, though ample for one, was rather short for 3, and I thought the Spanish grandiloquent politeness of Gomez, who was fat and old, was not over cordial. However, down we sat, and I was helped to a dish of rabbit, with what I thought to be an abundant sauce of tomato. Taking a good mouthful, I felt as though I had taken liquid fire. The tomato was chili colorado, or red pepper, of the purest kind. It nearly killed me, and I saw Gomez's eyes twinkle, for he saw that his share of supper was increased. I contented myself with bits of the meat, and an abundant supply of tortillas. Ord was better case-hardened, and stood it better. We stayed at Gomez's that night, sleeping, as all did, on the ground, and the next morning we crossed the hill by the bride path to the old mission of San Juan Bautista. The mission was in the beautiful valley, very level, and bounded on all sides by hills. The plain was covered with wild grasses and mustard, and had abundant water. Cattle and horses were seen in all directions, and it was manifest that the priests who first occupied the country were good judges of land. It was Sunday, and all the people, about 100, had come to church from the country round about. Ord was somewhat of a Catholic, and entered the church with the clanking spurs, and kneeled down, attracting the attention of all, for he had on the uniform of an American officer. As soon as church was out, all rushed to the various sports. I saw the priest, with his grey robes tucked up, playing at billiards. Others were cock-fighting, and some at horse-racing. My horse had become lame, and I resolved to buy another. As soon as it was known that I wanted a horse, several came for me, and displayed their horses by dashing past and hauling them up short. There was a fine black stallion that attracted my notice, and, after trying him myself, I concluded a purchase. I left with the seller my own lame horse, which he was to bring to me at Monterey, when I was to pay him $10 for the other. The mission of San Juan bore the marks of high prosperity at a former period, and had a good pear orchard just under the plateau where stood the church. After spending the day, Ord and I returned to Monterey, about 35 miles by a shorter route, thus passed the month of February, and though there were no mails or regular expresses, we heard occasionally from Yerba Buena and Sutter's Fort to the north, and from the Army and Navy about Los Angeles at the south. We also knew that a quarrel had grown up at Los Angeles between General Kearny, Colonel Fremont, and Commodore Stockton, as to the right to control affairs in California. Kearny had with him only the fragments of the 2 companies of dragoons, which had come across from New Mexico with him, and had been handled very roughly by Don Andres Pico, at San Pasqual, in which engagement Captains Moore and Johnson and Lieutenant Hammond were killed, and Kearny himself wounded. There remained with him Colonel Swords, a quartermaster, Captain H.S. Turner, 1st Dragoons, Captains Emery and Warner, topographical engineers, Assistant Surgeon Griffin, and Lieutenant J.W. Davidson. Fremont had marched down from the north with a battalion of volunteers. Commodore Stockton had marched up from San Diego to Los Angeles, with General Kearny, his dragoons, and a battalion of sailors and marines, and was soon joined there by Fremont, and they jointly received the surrender of the insurgents under Andres Pico. We also knew that General R.B. Mason had been ordered to California, that Colonel John D. Stevenson was coming out of California with a regiment of New York volunteers, that Commodore Shubrick had orders also from the Navy Department to control matters afloat, that General Kearny, by virtue of his rank, had the right to control all the land forces in the service of the United States, and that Fremont claimed the same right by virtue of a letter he had received from Colonel Benton, then a senator, and a man of great influence with Polk's administration, so that among the younger officers the query was quite natural. Who the devil is Governor of California? One day I was on board the Independence frigate dining with the ward-room officers, when a war vessel was reported in the offing, which in due time was made out to be the CN, Captain Dupont. After dinner we were all on deck to watch the new arrival, the ships meanwhile exchanging signals, which were interpreted that General Kearny was on board. As the CN approached, a boat was sent to meet her, with Commodore Shubrick's flag officer, Lieutenant Lewis, to carry the usual messages, and to invite General Kearny to come on aboard the Independence as the guest of Commodore Shubrick. Quite a number of officers were on deck, among them Lieutenant Wise, Montgomery Lewis, William Chapman, and others, noted wits and wags of the Navy. In due time the CN anchored close by, and our boat was seen returning with a stranger in the stern sheets, clothed in army blue. As the boat came nearer, we saw that it was General Kearny, with an old dragoon coat on, and an army cap, to which the general had added the broad visor, cut from a full dress hat, to shade his face and eyes against the glaring sun of the Gila region. Chapman exclaimed, "Fellows, the problem is solved. There is the Grand Vizier, visor. By God, he is Governor of California." All hands received the general with great heartiness, and he soon passed out of our sight into the Commodore's cabin. Between Commodore Shubrick and General Kearny existed from that time forward the greatest harmony and good feeling, and no further trouble existed as to the controlling power on the Pacific coast. General Kearny had dispatched from San Diego his quartermaster, Colonel Swords, to the Sandwich Islands, to purchase clothing and stores for his men, and had come up to Monterey, bringing with him Turner and Warner, leaving Emery and the company of dragoons below. He was delighted to find a full strong company of artillery subject to his orders, well supplied with clothing and money in all respects, and, much to the disgust of our Captain Tompkins, he took half of his company clothing, and part of the money held by me for the relief of his worn-out and almost naked dragoons left behind at Los Angeles. In a few days he moved on shore, took up his quarters at Larkin's house, and established his headquarters, with Captain Turner as his adjutant general. One day Turner and Warner were at my tent, and, seeing a store-box full of socks, drawers, and calico shirts, of which I had laid in a 3-year supply, and of which they had none, made known to me their wants, and I told them to help themselves, which Turner and Warner did. The latter, however, insisted on paying me the cost, and from that date to this, Turner and I have been close friends. Warner, poor fellow, was afterward killed by Indians. Things gradually came into shape. A semi-monthly courier line was established from Yerba Buena to San Diego, and we were thus enabled to keep peace with events throughout the country. In March, Stevenson's regiment arrived. Colonel Mason also arrived by sea from Callao in the store ship Erie, and P. St. George Cook's battalion of Mormons reached San Luis Rey. A.J. Smith and George Stoneman were with him, and were assigned to the company of dragoons at Los Angeles. All these troops in the Navy regarded General Kearny as the rightful commander, though Fremont still remained at Los Angeles, styling himself as governor, issuing orders and holding his battalion of California volunteers in apparent defiance of General Kearny. Colonel Mason and Major Turner were sent down by sea with a paymaster, with muster rolls, and orders to muster this battalion into the service of the United States, to pay and then to muster them out. But on their reaching Los Angeles, Fremont would not consent to it, and the controversy became so angry that a challenge was believed to have passed between Mason and Fremont, but the duel never came about. Turner rode up by land in 4 or 5 days, and Fremont, becoming alarmed, followed him, as we supposed, to overtake him, but he did not succeed. On Fremont's arrival at Monterey, he camped in a tent about a mile out of town and called on General Kearny, and it was reported that the latter threatened him very severely and ordered him back to Los Angeles immediately, to disband his volunteers and to cease the exercise of authority of any kind in the country. Feeling a natural curiosity to see Fremont, who was then quite famous by reason of his recent explorations and the still more recent conflicts with Kearny and Mason, I rode out to his camp, and found him in a conical tent with one Captain Owens, who was a mountaineer, trapper, etc., but originally from Zanesville, Ohio. I spent an hour or so with Fremont in his tent, took some tea with him, and left, without being much impressed with him. In due time, Colonel Swords returned from the Sandwich Islands and relieved me as quartermaster. Captain William G. Marcy, son of the Secretary of War, had also come out in one of Stevenson's ships as an assistant commissary of subsistence, and was stationed at Monterey and relieved me as commissary, so that I reverted to the condition of a company officer. While acting as a staff officer, I had lived at the custom house in Monterey, but when relieved I took a tent in line with the other company officers on the hill where we had mess. Stevenson's regiment reached San Francisco Bay early in March 1847. 3 companies were stationed at the Presidio under Major James A. Hardy, 1 company (at Sonoma), 3 under Colonel Stevenson at Monterey, and 3 under Lieutenant Colonel Burton at Santa Barbara. One day I was down at the headquarters at Larkin's house when General Kearney remarked to me that he was going down to Los Angeles in the ship Lexington, and wanted me to go along as his aide. Of course, this was most agreeable to me. 2 of Stevenson's companies, with the headquarters and the colonel, were to go also. They embarked, and early in May we sailed for San Pedro. Before embarking, the United States line of battleship, Columbus, had reached the coast from China with Commodore Biddle, whose rank gave him the supreme command of the Navy on the coast. He was busy in calling in lassoing from the land service the various naval officers who under Stockton had been doing all sorts of military and civil service on shore. Knowing that I was to go down the shore with General Kearney, he sent me and handed me 2 unsealed parcels addressed to Lieutenant Wilson, United States Navy, and Major Gillespie, United States Marines, at Los Angeles. These were written orders pretty much in these words: "On receipt of this order, you will repair at once on board the United States ship Lexington at San Pedro, and on reaching Monterey, you will report to the undersigned James Biddle." Of course, I executed my part to the letter, and these officers were duly lassoed. We sailed down the coast with a fair wind, and anchored inside the kelp, abreast of Johnson's house. Messages were forthwith dispatched up to Los Angeles, 20 miles off, and preparations for horses made for us to ride up. We landed, and, as Kearney held my arm in ascending the steep path up the bluff, he remarked to himself rather than to me that it was strange that Fremont did not want to return north by the Lexington on account of seasickness, but preferred to go by land over 500 miles. The younger officers had been discussing what the general would do with Fremont, who was supposed to be in a state of mutiny. Some thought he would be tried and shot, some that he would be carried back in irons, and all agreed that if anyone else than Fremont had put on such airs, and had acted as he had done, Kearney would have shown him no mercy, for he was regarded as the strictest sort of disciplinarian. We had a pleasant ride across the plain which lies between the seashore and Los Angeles, which we reached in about 3 hours, the infantry following on foot. We found Colonel P.T. St. George Cook living at the house of Mr. Pryor, and the company of dragoons, with A.J. Smith, Davidson, Stoneman, and Dr. Griffin, quartered in an adobe house close by. Fremont held his court in the only 2-story frame house in the place. After some time spent at Pryor's house, General Kearney ordered me to call on Fremont to notify him of his arrival, and that he desired to see him. I walked round to the house which had been pointed out to me as his, inquired of a man at the door if the colonel was in, was answered yes, and was conducted to a large room on the 2nd floor, where very soon Fremont came in, and I delivered my message. As I was on the point of leaving, he inquired where I was going to, and I answered that I was going back to Pryor's house, where the general was, when he remarked that if I would wait a moment he would go along. Of course I waited, and he soon joined me, dressed much as a Californian, with the peculiar high, broad-brimmed hat, with a fancy cord, and we walked together back to Pryor's, where I left him with General Kearney. We spent several days very pleasantly at Los Angeles, then, as now, the chief pueblo of the South, famous for its grapes, fruits, and wines. There was a hill close to the town, from which we had a perfect view of the place. The surrounding country is level, utterly devoid of trees except the willows and cottonwoods that lined Los Angeles Creek, and the acequias, or ditches, which led from it. The space of ground cultivated in vineyards seemed about 5 miles by 1, embracing the town. Every house had its enclosure of vineyard, which resembled a miniature orchard, the vines being very old, ranged in rows, trimmed very close, with irrigating ditches so arranged that a stream of water could be diverted between each row of vines. The Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers are fed by melting snows from a range of mountains to the east, and the quantity of cultivated land depends upon the amount of water. This did not seem to be very large, but the San Gabriel River, close by, was represented to contain a larger volume of water, affording the means of greatly enlarging the space for cultivation. The climate was so moderate that oranges, figs, pomegranates, etc., were generally to be found in every yard or enclosure. At the time of our visit, General Kearney was making his preparations to return overland to the United States, and he arranged to secure a volunteer escort out of the battalion of Mormons that was then stationed at San Luis Rey, under Colonel Cook and Major Hunt. This battalion was only enlisted for 1 year, and the time for their discharge was approaching, and it was generally understood that the majority of the men wanted to be discharged so as to join the Mormons who had halted at Salt Lake. But a lieutenant and about 40 men volunteered to return to Missouri as the escort of General Kearney. These were mounted on mules and horses, and I was appointed to conduct them to Monterey by land, leaving the party at Los Angeles to follow by sea in the Lexington. I started with a Mormon detachment and traveled by land. We averaged about 30 miles a day, stopped one day at Santa Barbara, where I saw Colonel Burton, and so on by the usual traveled road to Monterey, reaching it in about 15 days, arriving some days in advance of the Lexington. This gave me the best kind of an opportunity for seeing the country, which was very sparsely populated indeed, except by a few families at the various missions. We had no wheeled vehicles, but packed our food and clothing on mules driven ahead, and we slept on the ground in the open air, the rainy season having passed. Fremont followed me by land in a few days, and, by the end of May, General Kearney was already at Monterey to take his departure, leaving to succeed him in command Colonel R.B. Mason, 1st Dragoons. Our captain, Tompkins, too, had become discontented at his separation from his family, tendered his resignation to General Kearney, and availed himself of a sailing vessel bound for Callao to reach the east. Colonel Mason selected me as his adjutant general, and on the very last day of May, General Kearney, with his Mormon escort, with Colonel Cook, Colonel Swords, quartermaster, Captain Turner, and a naval officer, Captain Radford, took his departure for the east overland, leaving us in full possession of California and its fate. Fremont also left California with General Kearney, and with him departed all cause of confusion and disorder in the country. From that time forth no one could dispute the authority of Colonel Mason as in command of all the United States forces on the shore, while the senior naval officer had a like control afloat. This was Commodore James Biddle, who had reached the station from China in the Columbus, and in turn was succeeded by Commodore T. App Catesby Jones in the line of battleship Ohio. At that time Monterey was our headquarters, and the naval commander for a time remained there, but subsequently San Francisco Bay became the chief naval rendezvous. Colonel R.B. Mason, 1st Dragoons, was an officer of great experience, of stern character, deemed by some harsh and severe, but in all my intercourse with him he was kind and agreeable. He had a large fund of good sense, and, during our long period of service together, I enjoyed his unlimited confidence. He had been in his day a splendid shot and hunter, and often entertained me with characteristic anecdotes of Taylor, Twiggs, Worth, Harney, Martin Scott, etc., etc., who were then in Mexico gaining a national fame. California had settled down to a condition of absolute repose, and we naturally repined at our fate in being so remote from the war in Mexico, where our comrades were reaping large honors. Mason dwelt in a house not far from the Custom House, with Captain Landman, United States Navy. I had a small adobe house back of Larkin's. Halleck and Dr. Murray had a small log house not far off. The company of artillery was still on the hill, under the command of Lieutenant Ord, engaged in building a fort whereon to mount the guns we had brought out in the Lexington, and also in constructing quarters out of hewn pine logs for the men. Lieutenant Miner, a very clever young officer, had taken violently sick and died about the time I got back from Los Angeles, leaving Lieutenants Ord and Loser alone with the company, with Assistant Surgeon Robert Murray. Captain William G. Marcy was the quartermaster and commissary. Nagley's company of Stevenson's regiment had been mounted and was sent out against the Indians in the San Joaquin Valley, and Shannon's company occupied the barracks. Shortly after General Kearney had gone east, we found an order of his on record removing one Mr. Nash, the alcalde of Sonoma, and appointing to his place ex-Governor L. W. Boggs. A letter came to Colonel and Governor Mason from Boggs, whom he had personally known in Missouri, complaining that, though he had been appointed alcalde, The then incumbent, Nash, utterly denied Kearny's right to remove him, because he had been elected by the people under the proclamation of Commodore Sloat, and refused to surrender his office or to account for his acts as alcalde. Such a proclamation had been made by Commodore Sloat shortly after the first occupation of California, announcing that the people were free and enlightened American citizens, entitled to all rights and privileges as such, and among them the right to elect their own officers, etc. The people of Sonoma town and valley, some 40 or 50 immigrants from the United States, and very few native Californians, had elected Mr. Nash, and, as stated, he refused to recognize the right of a mere military commander to eject him and to appoint another to his place. Neither General Kearny nor Mason had much respect for this kind of bunkum, but assumed the true doctrine that California was yet a Mexican province, held by right of conquest, that the military commander was held responsible to the country, and that the province should be held in statu quo until a treaty of peace. This letter of Boggs was therefore referred to Captain Brackett, whose company was stationed at Sonoma, with orders to notify Nash that Boggs was the rightful alcalde, and that he must quietly surrender his office, with the books and records thereof, and that he must account for any moneys received from the sale of town lots, etc., etc., and in the event of refusal, he, Captain Brackett, must compel him by the use of force. In due time we got Brackett's answer, saying that the little community of Sonoma was in a dangerous state of effervescence caused by his orders, that Nash was backed by most of the Americans there who had come across from Missouri with American ideas, that as he, Brackett, was a volunteer officer, likely to be soon discharged, and as he designed to settle there, he asked in consequence to be excused from the execution of this, to him, unpleasant duty. Such a request, coming to an old soldier like Colonel Mason, aroused his wrath, and he would have proceeded roughshod against Brackett, who, by the way, was a West Point graduate, and ought to have known better, but I suggested to the colonel that, the case being a test one, he had better send me up to Sonoma, and I would settle it quick enough. He then gave me an order to go to Sonoma to carry out the instructions already given to Brackett. I took one soldier with me, Private Barnes, with 4 horses, 2 of which we rode, the other 2 we drove ahead. The first day we reached Gilroy's and camped by a stream near 3 or 4 adobe huts, known as Gilroy's Ranch. The next day we passed Murphy's, San Jose, and Santa Clara Mission, camping some 4 miles beyond, where a kind of hole had been dug in the ground for water. The whole of this distance, now so beautifully improved and settled, was then scarcely occupied, except by poor ranches producing horses and cattle. The pueblo of San Jose was a string of low adobe houses festooned with red peppers and garlic, and the mission of Santa Clara was a dilapidated concern, with its church and orchard. The long line of poplar trees lining the road from San Jose to Santa Clara bespoke a former period when the priests had ruled the land. Just about dark I was lying on the ground near the well, and my soldier Barnes had watered our horses and picketed them to grass, when we heard a horse crushing his way through the high mustard bushes, which filled the plain, and soon a man came to us to inquire if we had seen a saddle horse pass up the road. We explained to him what we had heard, and he went off in pursuit of his horse. Before dark he came back unsuccessful, and gave his name as Bidwell, the same gentleman who has since been a member of Congress, who is married to Miss Kennedy, of Washington City, and now lives in princely style at Chico, California. He explained that he was a surveyor, and had been in the lower country engaged in surveying land, that the horse had escaped him with his saddlebags containing all his notes and papers, and some $600 in money, all the money he had earned. He spent the night with us on the ground, and the next morning we left him there to continue the search for his horse, and I afterward heard that he had found his saddlebags all right, but never recovered the horse. The next day toward night we approached the mission of San Francisco, and the village of Yerba Buena, tired and weary, the wind as usual blowing a perfect hurricane, and a more desolate region it was impossible to conceive of. Leaving Barnes to work his way into the town as best as he could with the tired animals, I took the freshest horse and rode forward. I fell in with Lieutenant Fabius Stanley, United States Navy, and we rode into Yerba Buena together about an hour before sundown. There being nothing but a path from the mission into the town, deep and heavy with drift sand, my horse could hardly drag one foot after the other when we reached the old Hudson Bay Company's house, which was then the store of Howard and Mellis. There I learned where Captain Folsom, the quartermaster, was to be found. He was staying with the family of the name of Grimes, who had a small house back of Howard's store, which must have been near where Sacramento Street now crosses Kearny. Folsom was a classmate of mine, had come out with Stevenson's regiment as quartermaster, and was at the time the chief quartermaster of the department. His office was in the old custom house standing at the northwest corner of the plaza. He had hired 2 warehouses, the only ones there at the time, and one Leadsdorf, the principal man of Yerba Buena, who also owned the only public house or tavern, called the City Hotel, on Kearny Street, at the southeast corner of the plaza. I stopped with Folsom at Mrs. Grimes, and he sent my horse, as also the other 3 when Barnes had got in after dark, to a corral where he had a little barley, but no hay. At that time nobody fed a horse, but he was usually turned out to pick such scanty grass as he could find on the side hills. The few government horses used in town were usually sent out to the Presidio, where the grass was somewhat better. At that time, July 1847, what is now called San Francisco was called Yerba Buena. A naval officer, Lieutenant Washington A. Bartlett, its first alcalde, had caused it to be surveyed and laid out into blocks and lots, which were being sold at $16 a lot of 50 varas square, the understanding being that no single person could purchase of the alcalde more than 1 in-lot of 50 varas, and 1 outlot of 100 varas. Folsom, however, had got his clerks, orderlies, etc., to buy lots, and they, for a small consideration, conveyed them to him, so that he was nominally the owner of a good many lots. Lieutenant Halleck had bought 1 of each kind, and so had Warner. Many naval officers had also invested, and Captain Folsom advised me to buy some, but I felt actually insulted that he should think me such a fool as to pay money for property in such a horrid place as Yerba Buena, especially ridiculing his quarter of the city, then called Happy Valley. At that day Montgomery Street was, as now, the business street, extending from Jackson to Sacramento, the water of the bay leaving barely room for a few houses at its east side, and the public warehouses were on the sandy beach about where the Banks of California now stands, near the intersection of Sansome and California streets. Along Montgomery Street were the stores of Howard Amelis, Frank Ward, Sherman and Ruckle, Ross & Co., and it may be 1 or 2 others. Around the plaza were a few houses, among them the City Hotel and the Custom House, single-story adobes with tiled roofs, and they were by far the most substantial and best houses in the place. The population was estimated at about 400, of whom Kanakas, natives of the Sandwich Islands, formed the bulk. At the foot of Clay Street was a small wharf which small boats could reach at high tide, but the principal landing place was where some stones had fallen into the water, about where Broadway now intersects Battery Street. On the steep bluff above had been excavated by the Navy during the year before a bench wherein were mounted a couple of Navy guns, styled the Battery, which I suppose gave name to the street. I explained to Folsom the object of my visit, and learned from him that he had no boat in which to send me to Sonoma, and that the only chance to get there was to borrow a boat from the Navy. The line of battleship Columbus was then lying at anchor off the town, and he said if I would get up early the next morning, I could go off to her in 1 of the market boats. Accordingly, I was up bright and early, down at the wharf, found a boat, and went off to the Columbus to see Commodore Biddle. On reaching the ship, and stating to the officer of the deck my business, I was shown into the Commodore's cabin, and soon made known to him my object. Biddle was a middle-sized man, but vivacious in the extreme. He had a perfect contempt for all humbug, and at once entered into the business with extreme alacrity. I was somewhat amused at the importance he attached to the step. He had a chaplain, and a private secretary, and a small room latticed off from his cabin, and he first called on them to go out, and, when we were alone, he enlarged on the folly of Sloat's proclamation, giving the people the right to elect their own officers, and commended Kearny and Mason for nipping that idea in the bud, and keeping the power in their own hands. He then sent for the first lieutenant, Drayton, and inquired if there were any among the officers on board any who had ever been in the upper bay, and learning that there was a midshipman, Whitaker, he was sent for. It so happened that this midshipman had been on a frolic on shore a few nights before, and was accordingly much frightened when summoned into the Commodore's presence. But as soon as he was questioned as to his knowledge of the bay, he was sensibly relieved, and professed to know everything about it. Accordingly, the long-boat was ordered with this midshipman and 8 sailors. prepared with water and provisions for several days' absence. Biddle then asked me if I knew any of his own officers, and which one of them I would prefer to accompany me. I knew most of them, and we settled down on Lewis McLean. He was sent for, and it was settled that McLean and I were to conduct this important mission, and the Commodore enjoined us on complete secrecy, so as to ensure success, and he especially cautioned us against being pumped by his wardroom officers, Chapman, Lewis, Wise, etc., while on board his ship. With this injunction, I was dismissed to the wardroom, where I found Chapman, Lewis, and Wise dreadfully exercised at our profound secrecy. The fact that McLean and I had been closeted with the Commodore for an hour, that orders for the boat and stores had been made, and that chaplain and clerk had been sent out of the cabin, etc., etc., all excited their curiosity. But McLean and I kept our secret well. The general impression was that we had some knowledge about the fate of Captain Montgomery's 2 sons and the crew that had been lost the year before. In 1846, Captain Montgomery commanded at Yerba Buena, on board the St. Mary sloop of war, and he had a detachment of men stationed up at Sonoma. Occasionally a boat was sent up with provisions or intelligence to them. Montgomery had 2 sons aboard his ship, one a midshipman, the other his secretary. Having occasion to send some money up to Sonoma, he sent his 2 sons with a good boat and crew. The boat started with a strong breeze and a very large sail, was watched from the deck until she was out of sight, and was never heard of since. There was, of course, much speculation as to their fate, some contending that the boat must have been capsized in San Pablo Bay, and that all were lost, others contending that the crew had murdered the officers for the money, and then escaped, but, so far as I know, not a man of that crew has ever been seen or heard of since. When at last the boat was ready for us, we started, leaving all hands, save the Commodore, impressed with the belief that we were going on some errand connected with the loss of the missing boat and crew of the St. Mary. We sailed directly north, up the bay and across San Pablo, reached the mouth of the Sonoma Creek about dark, and during the night worked up the creek some 12 miles by means of the tide, to a landing called the Embarcadero. To maintain the secrecy which the Commodore had enjoined us on, McLean and I agreed to keep up the delusion by pretending to be on a marketing expedition to pick up chickens, pigs, etc., for the mess of the Columbus, soon to depart for home. Leaving the midshipmen and 4 sailors to guard the boat, we started on foot with the other 4 for Sonoma town, which we soon reached. It was a simple open square, around which were some adobe houses, that of General Vallejo occupying one side. On another was an unfinished 2-story adobe house occupied as a barrack by Brackett's company. We soon found Captain Brackett, and I told him that I intended to take Nash a prisoner and convey him back to Monterey to answer for his mutinous behavior. I got an old sergeant of his company, whom I had known in the 3rd Artillery, quietly to ascertain the whereabouts of Nash, who was a bachelor, stopping with the family of a lawyer named Green. The sergeant soon returned, saying that Nash had gone over to Napa, but would be back that evening. So McLean and I went up to a farm of some pretensions, occupied by one Andreas Hoppner, with a pretty Sitka wife, who lived a couple of miles above Sonoma, and we bought of him some chickens, pigs, etc. We then visited Governor Boggs' family and that of General Vallejo, who was then, as now, one of the most prominent and influential natives of California. About dark, I learned that Nash had come back, and then, giving Brackett orders to have a cart ready at the corner of the plaza, McLean and I went to the house of Green. Posting an armed sailor on each side of the house, we knocked at the door and walked in. We found Green, Nash, and 2 women at supper. I inquired if Nash were in, and was first answered no, but one of the women soon pointed to him, and he rose. We were armed with pistols, and the family was evidently alarmed. I walked up to him and took his arm, and told him to come along with me. He asked me where, and I said, Monterey. Why? I would explain that more at leisure. Green put himself between me and the door, and demanded, in theatrical style, why I dared arrest a peaceable citizen in his house. I simply pointed to my pistol and told him to get out of the way, which he did. Nash asked to get some clothing, but I told him he should want for nothing. We passed out, Green following us with loud words, which brought the 4 sailors to the front door, when I told him to hush up or I would take him prisoner also. About the time one of the sailors, handling his pistol carelessly, discharged it, and Green disappeared very suddenly. We took Nash to the cart, put him in, and proceeded back to our boat. The next morning we were gone. Nash being out of the way, Boggs entered on his office, and the right to appoint or remove from civil office was never again questioned in California during the military regime. Nash was an old man, and was very much alarmed for his personal safety. He had come across the plains, and had never yet seen the sea. While on our way down the bay, I explained fully to him the state of things in California, and he admitted he had never looked on it in that light before, and professed a willingness to surrender his office, but having gone so far, I thought it best to take him to Monterey. On our way down the bay, the wind was so strong as we approached the Columbus that we had to take refuge behind Yerba Buena Island, then called Goat Island, where we landed, and I killed a gray seal. The next morning, the wind being comparatively light, we got out and worked our way up to the Columbus, where I left my prisoner on board, and went on shore to find Commodore Biddle, who had gone to dine with Frank Ward. I found him there, and committed Nash to his charge, with the request that he would send him down to Monterey, which he did in the sloop of war Dale, Captain Selfridge commanding. I then returned to Monterey by land, and, when the Dale arrived, Colonel Mason and I went on board, found poor old Nash half dead with seasickness and fear, lest Colonel Mason would treat him with extreme military rigor. But on the contrary, the colonel spoke to him kindly, released him as a prisoner on his promise to go back to Sonoma, surrender his office to Boggs, and account to him for his acts while in office. He afterward came on shore, was provided with clothing and a horse, returned to Sonoma, and I have never seen him since. Matters and things settled down in Upper California, and all moved along with peace and harmony. The war still continued in Mexico, and the Navy authorities resolved to employ their time with the capture of Mazatlan and Guaymas. Lower California had already been occupied by 2 companies of Stevenson's regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Burton, who had taken post at La Paz, and a small party of sailors was on shore at San Josef, near Cape San Lucas, detached from the Lexington, Lieutenant Commander Bailey. The orders for this occupation were made by General Kearny before he left, in pursuance of instructions from the War Department, merely to subserve a political end, for there were few or no people in Lower California, which is a miserable, wretched, dried-up peninsula. I remember the proclamation made by Burton and Captain Bailey in taking possession, which was in the usual florid style. Bailey signed his name as a superior naval officer at the station, but, as it was necessary to put it into Spanish to reach the inhabitants of the newly acquired country, it was interpreted el más antiguo de todos los oficiales de la Marina, etc., which literally is the most ancient of all the naval officers, etc., a translation at which we made some fun. The expedition to Mazatlan was, however, for a different purpose, viz., to get possession of the ports of Mazatlan and Guaymas, as a part of the war against Mexico, and not for permanent conquest. Commodore Shubrick commanded this expedition and took Halleck along as his engineer officer. They captured Mazatlan and Guaymas, and then called on Colonel Mason to send soldiers down to hold possession, but he had none to spare, and it was found impossible to raise other volunteers either in California or Oregon, and the Navy held these places by detachments of sailors and marines till the end of the war. Burton also called for reinforcements, and Nagley's company was sent to him from Monterey, and these 3 companies occupied Lower California at the end of the Mexican War. Major Hardy still commanded at San Francisco and above. Company F, 3rd Artillery, and Shannon's company of volunteers were at Monterey, Lippett's company at Santa Barbara. Colonel Stevenson, with 1 company of his regiment, and the company of the 1st Dragoons, was at Los Angeles, and a company of Mormons re-enlisted out of the Mormon Battalion garrisoned San Diego, and thus matters went along throughout 1847 into 1848. I had occasion to make several trips to Yerba Buena and back, and in the spring of 1848 Colonel Mason and I went down to Santa Barbara in the sloop of war Dale. I spent much time in hunting deer and bear in the mountains back of the Carmel Mission, and ducks and geese in the plains of the Salinas. As soon as the fall rains set in, the young oats would sprout up, and myriads of ducks, brant, and geese made their appearance. In a single day, or rather in the evening of one day and the morning of the next, I could load a pack mule with geese and ducks. They had grown somewhat wild from the increased number of hunters, yet, by marking well the place where a flock lighted, I could, by taking advantage of the gullies or the shape of the ground, creep up within range, and, giving 1 barrel on the ground, the other as they rose, I have secured as many as 9 at one discharge. Colonel Mason at one occasion killed 11 geese by one discharge of small shot. The seasons in California are well marked. About October and November the rains begin, and the whole country, plains and mountains, become covered with a bright green grass, with endless flowers. The intervals between the rain give the finest weather possible. These rains are less frequent in March, and cease altogether in April and May, when gradually the grass dies and the whole aspect of things changes, first to yellow, then to brown, and by midsummer all is burnt up and dry as an ash heap. When General Kearney first departed, we took his office at Larkin's, but shortly afterward we had a broad stairway constructed to lead from the outside to the upper front porch of the barracks. By cutting a large door through the adobe wall, we made the upper room. In the center of our office, and another side room connected with it by a door, was Colonel Mason's private office. I had a single clerk, a soldier named Baden, and William E. P. Hartnell, citizen, also had a table in the same room. He was the government interpreter, and had charge of the civil archives. After Halleck's return from Mazatlan, he was, by Colonel Mason, made Secretary of State, and he then had charge of the civil archives, including the land titles of which Fremont first had possession, but which had reverted to us when he left the country. I remember one day in the spring of 1848 the two men, Americans, came into the office and inquired for the governor. I asked their business, and one answered that they had just come down from Captain Sutter on special business, and they wanted to see Governor Mason in person. I took them in to the colonel, and left them together. After some time the colonel came to his door and called to me. I went in, and my attention was directed to a series of papers unfolded on his table, in which lay about half an ounce of placer gold. Mason said to me, "What is that?" And I touched it and examined it, one or two of the larger pieces, and asked, "Is it gold?" Mason asked me if I had ever seen native gold. I answered that in 1844 I was in Upper Georgia, and there saw some native gold, but it was much finer than this, and that it was in files, or in transparent quills. But I said that, if this were gold, it could be easily tested, first by its malleability, and next by acids. I took a piece in my teeth, and the metallic luster was perfect. I then called for the clerk, Baden, to bring an axe and hatchet from the backyard. When these were brought, I took the largest piece and beat it out flat, and beyond doubt it was metal, and a pure metal. Still, we attached little importance to the fact, for gold was known to exist at San Fernando, at the south, and yet was not considered of much value. Colonel Mason then handed me a letter from Captain Sutter, addressed to him, stating that he, Sutter, was engaged in erecting a sawmill at Coloma, about 40 miles up the American Fork, above his fort at New Helvetia, for the general benefit of the settlers in that vicinity; that he had incurred considerable expense and wanted a preemption to the quarter section of land on which the mill was located, embracing the tail race in which this particular gold had been found. Mason instructed me to prepare a letter, in answer, for his signature. I wrote off a letter, reciting that California was yet a Mexican province, simply held by us as a conquest, that no laws of the United States yet applied to it, much less the land laws or preemption laws, which could only apply after a public survey. Therefore, it was impossible for the governor to promise him, Sutter, a title to the land. Yet, as there were no settlements within 40 miles, he was not likely to be disturbed by trespassers. Colonel Mason signed the letter, handed it to one of the gentlemen who had brought the sample of gold, and they departed. The gold was the first discovered in the Sierra Nevada, which soon revolutionized the whole country, and actually moved the whole civilized world. About this time, May and June 1848, far more importance was attached to quicksilver. One mine, the New Almaden, 12 miles south of San Jose, was well known, and was in possession of the agent of a Scotch gentleman named Forbes, who at the time was British consul at Tepic, Mexico. Mr. Forbes came up from the San Blas in a small brig, which proved to be a Mexican vessel. The vessel was seized, condemned, and actually sold, but Forbes was wealthy and bought her in. His title to the quicksilver mine was, however, never disputed, as he had bought it regularly, before our conquest of the country, from another British subject, also named Forbes, a resident of Santa Clara Mission, who had purchased it of the discoverer, a priest. But the boundaries of the land attached to the mine were even then in dispute. Other men were in search of quicksilver, and the whole range of mountains near the New Almaden mine was stained with the brilliant red of the sulphuret of mercury, cinnabar. A company composed of T.O. Larkin, J.R. Snyder, and others, among them one John Rickard, who was quite a character, also claimed a valuable mine nearby. Rickard was a lawyer from about Buffalo, and by some means had got to the Sandwich Islands, where he became a great favorite of the king, Kamehameha, with his attorney general, and got into a difficulty with the Reverend Mr. Judd, who was kind of a prime minister to his majesty. One or the other had to go, and Rickard left for San Francisco, where he arrived while Colonel Mason and I were there on some business connected with the customs. Rickard at once made a dead set at Mason with flattery and all sorts of spurious arguments, to convince him that our military government was too simple in its forms for the new state of facts, and that he was the man to remodel it. I heard a good deal to his prejudice, and did all I could to prevent Mason taking him into his confidence. We then started back for Monterey. Rickard was along, and night and day he was harping on his scheme, but he disgusted Colonel Mason with his flattery, and on reaching Monterey he opened what he called a law office, but there were neither courts nor clients, so necessity forced him to turn his thoughts to something else, and quicksilver became his hobby. In the spring of 1848, an appeal came to our office from San Jose, which compelled the governor to go up in person. Lieutenant Lozer and I, with a couple of soldiers, went along. At San Jose the governor held some kind of a court, in which Rickard and the alcalde had a warm dispute about a certain mine which Rickard, as a member of the Larkin Company, had opened within the limits claimed by the New Almaden Company. On our way up we had visited the ground, and were therefore better prepared to understand the controversy. We had found at New Almaden Mr. Walkinshaw, a fine Scotch gentleman, the resident agent of Mr. Forbes. He had built in the valley, near a small stream, a few board houses, and some 4 or 5 furnaces for the distillation of the mercury. These were very simple in their structure, being composed of whalers' kettles set in masonry. These kettles were filled with broken ore about the size of macadam stone, mingled with lime. Another kettle, reversed, formed the lid, and the seam was luted with clay. On applying heat, the mercury was volatilized and carried into the chimney stack, where it condensed and flowed back into a reservoir, and then was led in pipes into another kettle outside. After witnessing this process, we visited the mine itself, which outcropped near the apex of the hill, about 1,000 feet above the furnaces. We found wagons hauling the mineral down the hill and returning empty, and in the mines quite a number of Sonora miners were blasting and driving for the beautiful ore, cinnabar. It was then, and is now, a most valuable mine. The audit of the mine was at the apex of the hill, which drooped off to the north. We rode along this hill, and saw where many openings had been begun, but these, proving little or no value, had been abandoned. 3 miles beyond, on the west face of the hill, we came to the opening of the Larkin Company. There was evidence of a good deal of work, but the mine itself was filled up by what seemed a landslide. The question involved in the lawsuit before the alcalde at San Jose was, first, whether the mine was or was not on the land belonging to the New Almaden Company, whether the mine was or was not on the land belonging to the New Almaden property, and, next, whether the company had complied with all the conditions of the mining laws of Mexico, which were construed to be still in force in California. The laws required that anyone who discovered a valuable mine on private land should first file with the alcalde, or judge, of the district, a notice and claim for the benefit of such discovery. Then the mine was to be opened and allowed for a distance of at least 100 feet within a specified time, and the claimants must take out samples of the mineral and deposit the same with the alcalde, who was then required to inspect personally the mine, to see that it fulfilled all conditions of the law. Before he could give a written title, in this case the alcalde had been to the mine and had possession of samples of the ore, but as the mouth of the mine was closed up, as alleged, from the act of God by a landslide, it was contended by Rickard and his associates that it was competent to prove by good witnesses that the mine had been opened into the hill 100 feet, and that, by no negligence of theirs, it had caved in. It was generally understood that Robert J. Walker, United States Secretary of the Treasury, was then a partner in this mining company, and a vessel, the bark Gray Eagle, was ready at San Francisco to sail for New York with the title papers on which to base a joint stock company for speculative uses. I think the alcalde was satisfied that the law had been complied with, that he had given the necessary papers, and, as at that time there was nothing developed to show fraud, the governor, Mason, did not interfere. At that date there was no public house or tavern in San Jose where we could stop, so we started toward Santa Cruz and encamped about 10 miles out, to the west of the town, where we fell in with another party of explorers, of whom Ruckle of San Francisco was the head. And after supper, as we sat around the campfire, the conversation turned on Quicksilver in general, and the result of the contest in San Jose in particular. Mason was relating to Ruckle the points in the arguments of Rickard, that the company should not suffer from an act of God, by the caving in of the mouth of the mine, when a man named Cash, a fellow who had once been in the quartermaster's employ as a teamster, spoke up. Governor Mason, did Judge Rickard say that? Yes, said the governor, and then Cash related how he and another man, whose name he gave, had been employed by Rickard to undermine a heavy rock that rested above the mouth of the mine, so that it tumbled down, carrying with it a large quantity of earth, and completely filled it up, as we had seen. And, said Cash, it took us 3 days of the hardest kind of work. This was the act of God, and on the papers procured from the alcalde at the time, I understand, was built a huge speculation, by which thousands of dollars changed hands in the United States and were lost. This happened long before the celebrated McGarahan claim, which has produced so much noise and which still is being prosecuted in the courts and in Congress. On the next day we crossed over to the Santa Cruz Mountains, from which we had sublime views of the scenery, first looking east toward the lower bay of San Francisco, with the bright plains of Santa Clara and San Jose, and then to the west upon the ocean, the town of Monterey being visible 60 miles off. If memory is correct, we beheld from that mountain the firing of a salute from the battery at Monterey, and counted the number of guns from the white puffs of smoke, but could not hear the sound. That night we slept on piles of wheat in a mill at Sokol, near Santa Cruz, and our supplies being short, I advised that we should make an early start next morning, so as to reach the ranch of Don Juan Antonio Vallejo, a particular friend who had a large and valuable cattle ranch on the Pajero River, about 20 miles on our way to Monterey. Accordingly, we were off by the first light of the day, and by 9 o'clock we had reached the ranch. It was on a high point of the plateau, overlooking the plain of the Pajero, on which were grazing numbers of horses and cattle. The house was of adobe, with a long range of adobe huts occupied by the semi-civilized Indians, who at the time did all the labor of the ranch, the herding and marking of the cattle, breaking of horses, and cultivating the little patches of wheat and vegetables which constituted all the farming of that day. Everything about the house looked deserted, and, seeing a small Indian boy leaning up against a post, I approached him and asked him in Spanish, "Where is the master?" "Gone to the Presidio." "Monterey." "Is anybody in the house?" "No." "Is it locked up?" "Yes." "Is no one about who can get in?" "No." "Have you any meat?" "No." "Have you any flour or grain?" "No." "Any chickens?" "No." "Any eggs?" "No." "What do you live on?" "Nada, nothing." The utter indifference of this boy and the tone of his answer, "nada," attracted the attention of Colonel Mason, who had been listening to our conversation, and who knew enough of Spanish to catch the meaning, and he exclaimed with some feeling, "So we get nada for our breakfast." I felt mortified, for I had held out the prospect of a splendid breakfast of meat and tortillas, with rice, chickens, eggs, etc., at the ranch of my friend Jose Antonio, as a justification for taking the governor, a man of 60 years of age, more than 20 miles at a full canter for his breakfast. But there was no help for it, and we accordingly went a short distance to a pond, where we unpacked our mules and made a slim breakfast on some scraps of hard bread and a bone of pork that remained in our alforjas. This was no uncommon thing in those days, when many a ranchero, with his 11 leagues of land, his hundreds of horses and thousands of cattle, would receive us with all the grandiloquence of a Spanish lord, and confess that he had nothing in his house to eat except the carcass of a beef hung up, for which the stranger might cut and hook, without money or price, what he needed. That night we slept in the Salinas plain, and the next morning reached Monterey. All the missions and houses at that period were alive with fleas, which the natives looked on as pleasant titilators. But they so tortured me, and I also gave them a wide berth, and slept on a saddle blanket, with the saddle for a pillow and the serape, or blanket, for a cover. We never feared rain except in the winter, As the spring and summer of 1848 advanced, the reports came faster and faster from the gold mines at Sutter's sawmill. Stories reached us of fabulous discoveries, and spread throughout the land. Everybody was talking of gold, gold, until it assumed the character of a fever. Some of our soldiers began to desert. Citizens were fitting out trains and wagons and pack mules to go to the mines. We heard of men earning $50, $500, and thousands of dollars per day. And for a time it seemed as though somebody would reach solid gold. Some of this gold began to come to Yerba Buena in trade, and to disrupt the value of merchandise, particularly of mules, horses, tin pans, and articles used in mining. I, of course, could not escape the infection, and at last convinced Colonel Mason that it was our duty to go up and see with our own eyes, that we might report the truth to our government. As yet we had no regular mail to any part of the United States, but mails had come to us at long intervals around Cape Horn, and one or two overland. I well remember the first overland mail. It was brought by Kit Carson in saddlebags from Taos in New Mexico. We heard of his arrival at Los Angeles, and waited patiently for his arrival at headquarters. His fame then was at its height, from the publication of Fremont's books, and I was very anxious to see a man who had achieved such feats of daring among the wild animals of the Rocky Mountains, and still wilder Indians of the plains. At last his arrival was reported at the tavern at Monterey, and I hurried to hunt him up. I cannot express my surprise at beholding a small, stoop-shouldered man with reddish hair, freckled face, soft blue eyes, and nothing to indicate extraordinary courage or daring. He spoke but little, and answered questions in monosyllables. I asked for his mail, and he picked up his light saddlebags containing the great overland mail, and we walked together to headquarters, where he delivered his parcel into Colonel Mason's own hands. He spent some days in Monterey, during which time we extracted with difficulty some items of his personal history. He was then by commission a lieutenant in the regiment of mounted rifles, serving in Mexico under Colonel Sumner, and as he could not reach his regiment from California, Colonel Mason ordered that for a time he could be assigned to duty with A.J. Smith's company, 1st Dragoons, at Los Angeles. He remained at Los Angeles some months, and was then sent back to the United States with dispatches, traveling 2,000 miles almost alone, in preference to being encumbered by a large party. Toward the close of June 1848, the gold fever being at its height, by Colonel Mason's orders I made preparations for his trip to the newly discovered gold mines at Sutter's Fort. I selected 4 good soldiers, with Aaron, Colonel Mason's black servant, and a good outfit of horses and pack mules. We started by the usually traveled route for Yerba Buena. There, Captain Folsom and 2 citizens joined our party. The first difficulty was to cross the bay to Sausalito. Folsom, as quartermaster, had a sort of scow with a large sail, with which to discharge the cargoes of ships that could not come within a mile of the shore. It took nearly the whole day to get the old scow up to the only wharf there, and then the water was so shallow that the scow, with its load of horses, would not float at the first high tide. But by infinite labor on the next tide she was got off and safely crossed over to Sausalito. We followed in a more comfortable schooner. Having safely landed our horses and mules, we packed up and rode to San Rafael Mission, stopping with Don Timoteo Murphy. The next day's journey took us to Bodega, where lived a man named Stephen Smith, who had the only steam sawmill in California. He had a Peruvian wife, and employed a number of absolutely naked Indians in making adobes. We spent a day very pleasantly with him, and learned that he had come to California some years before, at the personal advice of Daniel Webster, who had informed him that sooner or later the United States would be in possession of California, and that in consequence it would become a great country. From Bodega we traveled to Sonoma, by way of Petaluma, and spent a day with General Vallejo. I had been there before, as related, in the business of the alcalde Nash. From Sonoma we crossed over by way of Napa, Sassoon, and Vaca's Ranch, to the Puta. In the rainy season the plain between the Puta and Sacramento rivers is impassable, but in July the waters dry up, and we passed without trouble, by the trail for Sutter's Embarcadero. We reached the Sacramento River, then full of water, with a deep, clear current. The only means of crossing over was by an Indian dug-out canoe. We began by carrying across our packs and saddles, and then our people. When all things were ready, the horses were driven into the water, one being guided ahead by a man in a canoe. Of course, the horses and mules at first refused to take the water, and it was nearly a day's work to get them across, and even then some of our animals after crossing escaped into the woods and undergrowth that lined the river, but we secured enough of them to reach Sutter's Fort, 3 miles back from the Embarcadero, where we encamped at the Old Slough, or pond, near the fort. On application, Captain Sutter sent some Indians back into the bushes, who recovered and brought in all our animals. At the time there was not the sign of a habitation there or thereabouts, except the fort, and an old adobe house east of the fort, known as the hospital. The fort itself was one of the adobe walls, about 20 feet high, rectangular in form, with 2-story blockhouses at diagonal corners. The entrance was by a large gate, open by day and closed at night, with 2 iron ship's guns near at hand. Inside there was a large house, with a good shingle roof, used as a storehouse, and all around the walls were ranged rooms, the fort walls being the outer wall of the house. The inner wall also was of adobe. These rooms were used by Captain Sutter himself and by his people. He had a blacksmith shop, carpenter's shop, etc., and other rooms where the women made blankets. Sutter was monarch of all he surveyed, and had authority to inflict punishment even unto death, a power he did not fail to use. He had horses, cattle, and sheep, and of these he gave liberally and without price to all in need. He caused to be driven into our camp a beef and some sheep, which were slaughtered for our use. Already the gold mines were beginning to be felt. Many people were then encamped, some going and some coming, all full of gold stories, and each surpassing the other. We found preparations in progress for celebrating the 4th of July, then close at hand, and we agreed to remain over to assist the occasion. Of course, being the high officials, we were honored guests. People came from a great distance to attend this celebration of the 4th of July, and the tables were laid in the large room inside the storehouse of the fort. A man of some note, named Sinclair, presided, and after a substantial meal and a reasonable supply of aguardiente, we began the toasts. All that I remember is that Folsom and I spoke for our party. Others, Captain Sutter included, made speeches, and before the celebration was over, Sutter was enthusiastic, and many others showed the effects of the aguardiente. The next day, namely July 5th, 1848, we resumed our journey toward the mines, and, in 25 miles of as hot and dusty a ride as possible, we reached Mormon Island. I have heretofore stated that the gold was first found in the trail race of the sawmill at Coloma, 40 miles above Sutter's Fort, or 15 above Mormon Island, in the bed of the American Fork of the Sacramento River. It seems that Sutter had employed an American named Marshall, a sort of millwright, to do this work for him. But Marshall afterward claimed that in the matter of the sawmill they were co-partners. At all events, Marshall and the family of Mr. Wilmer were living at Coloma, where the pine trees afforded the best material for lumber. He had under him 4 white men, Mormons, who had been discharged from Cook's battalion, and some Indians. These were engaged in hewing logs, building a mill dam, and putting up a sawmill. Marshall, as the architect, had made the tub wheel, and had set it in motion, and had also furnished some of the rude parts of machinery necessary for an ordinary up-and-down sawmill. Labor was very scarce, expensive, and had to be economized. The mill was built over a dry channel of the river, which was calculated to be the tail race. After arranging his head race, dam, the tub wheel, he let on the water to test the goodness of his machinery. It worked very well, until it was found that the tail race did not carry off the water fast enough, so he set his men to work in a rude way to clear out the tail race. They scratched a kind of ditch down the middle of the dry channel, throwing the coarser stones to one side, then letting on the water again. It would run with velocity down the channel, washing away the dirt, thus saving labor. This course of action was repeated several times, acting exactly like the long tom, afterward resorted to by the miners. As Marshall himself was working in this ditch, he observed particles of yellow metal which he gathered up in his hand, when it seemed to have suddenly flashed across his mind that it was gold. After picking up about an ounce, he hurried down to the fort to report to Captain Sutter his discovery. Captain Sutter himself related to me Marshall's account, saying that, as he sat in his room at the fort one day in February or March 1848, a knock was heard at his door, and he called out, "Come in." In walked Marshall, who was a half-crazy man at best, but then looked strangely wild. "What is the matter, Marshal?" Marshal inquired if anyone was within hearing, and began to peer about the room, and looked under the bed, when Sutter, fearing that some calamity had befallen the party up at the sawmill, and that Marshal was really crazy, began to make his way to the door, demanding of Marshal to explain what was the matter. At last he revealed his discovery, and laid before Captain Sutter the pellicles of gold he had picked up in the ditch. At first, Sutter attached little or no importance to the discovery, and told Marshal to go back to the mill, and say nothing of what he had seen to Mr. Wimmer, or anyone else. Yet, as it might add value to the location, he dispatched to our headquarters at Monterey, as I have already related, the two men with a written application for preemption to the quarter section of land at Coloma. Marshal returned to the mill, but could not keep out of his wonderful ditch, and by some means the other men employed there learned his secret. They then wanted to gather the gold, and Marshal threatened to shoot them if they attempted it. But these men had sense enough to know that if placer gold existed at Coloma, it would also be found farther downstream, and they gradually prospected until they reached Mormon Island, 15 miles below, where they discovered one of the richest placers on earth. These men revealed the fact to some other Mormons who were employed by Captain Sutter at a grist mill he was building still lower down the American Fork, and 6 miles above his fort. All of them struck for higher wages, to which Sutter yielded, until they asked $10 a day, which he refused, and the 2 mills on which he had spent so much money were never built, and fell into decay. In my opinion, when the Mormons were driven from Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1844, they cast about for a land where they would not be disturbed again, and fixed on California. In the year 1845, a ship, the Brooklyn, sailed from New York to California, with a colony of Mormons, of which Sam Brannan was the leader, and we found them there on our arrival in January 1847. When General Kearny, at Fort Leavenworth, was collecting volunteers early in 1846 for the Mexican War, he, through the instrumentality of Captain James Allen, brother to our quartermaster, General Robert Allen, raised the battalion of Mormons at Canesville, Iowa, now Council Bluffs, on the express understanding that it would facilitate their migration to California. But when the Mormons reached Salt Lake in 1846, they learned that they had been forestalled by the United States forces in California, and they then determined to settle where they were. Therefore, when this battalion of 5 companies of Mormons, raised by Allen, who died on the way and was succeeded by Cook, was discharged at Los Angeles, California in the early summer of 1847, most of the men went to their people at Salt Lake, with all the money received as pay from the United States. Invested in cattle and breeding horses, one company re-enlisted for another year, and the remainder sought work in the country. As soon as the fame of the gold discovery spread through California, the Mormons naturally turned to Mormon Island, so that in July 1848 we found about 300 of them there at work. Sam Brannan was on hand as the high priest, collecting the tithes. Clark, of Clark's Point, an early pioneer, was there also, and nearly all the Mormons who had come out in the Brooklyn, or who had stayed in California after the discharge of their battalion, had collected there. I recall the scene as perfectly today as though it were yesterday. In the midst of a broken country, all parched and dried by the hot sun of July, sparsely wooded with live oaks and straggling pines, lay the valley of the American River, with its bold mountain stream coming out of the snowy mountains to the east. In this valley is a flat or gravel bed, which in high water is an island or is overflown, but at the time of our visit was simply a level gravel bed of the river. On its edges men were digging and filling buckets with the finer earth and gravel, which was carried to a machine made like a baby's cradle, open at the foot, and at the head a plate of sheet iron or zinc, punctured full of holes. On this metallic plate was emptied the earth, and water was then poured on it from buckets, while one man shook the cradle with violent rocking by a handle. On the bottom were nailed cleats of wood. With this rude machine 4 men could earn from $40 to $100 a day, averaging $16 for a gold ounce per man per day. While the sun blazed down on the heads of the miners with tropical heat, the water was bitter cold, and all hands were either standing in the water or had their clothes wet all the time. Yet there were no complaints of rheumatism or cold. We made our camp on a small knoll, a little below the island, and from it could overlook the busy scene. A few bush huts near by served as stores, boarding houses, and for sleeping, but all hands slept on the ground, with pine leaves and blankets for bedding. As soon as the news spread that the governor was there, persons came to see us and volunteered all kinds of information, illustrating it by samples of the gold, which was of the uniform kind, scale gold, bright and beautiful. A large variety of every conceivable shape and form was found in the smaller gulches round about, but the gold in the riverbed was uniformly scale gold. I remember that Mr. Clark was in camp, talking to Colonel Mason about matters and things generally, when he inquired, "Governor, what business has Sam Brannan to collect tithes here?" Clark admitted that Brannan was the head of the Mormon Church in California, and he was simply questioning as to Brannan's right, as high priest, to compel the Mormons to pay him the regular tithes. Colonel Mason answered, "Brannan has a perfect right to collect the tax if you Mormons are fool enough to pay it." "Then," said Clark, "I for one won't pay it any longer." Colonel Mason added, "This is public land, and the gold is the property of the United States. All of you here are trespassers, but as the government is benefited by your getting out the gold, I do not intend to interfere." I understood, afterward, that from the time the payment of the tithes ceased, but Brannan had already collected enough money wherewith to hire Sutter's Hospital and to open a store there, in which he made more money than any merchant in California during the summer and fall. The understanding was that the money collected by him as tithes was the foundation of his fortune, which is still very large in San Francisco. That evening we all mingled freely with the miners and witnessed the process of cleaning up and panning out, which is the last process for separating the pure gold from the fine dirt and black sand. The next day we continued our journey up the valley of the American Fork, stopping at various camps where mining was in progress, and about noon we reached Coloma, the place where gold had been first discovered. The hills were higher and the timber of better quality. The river was narrower and bolder, and but few miners were at work there, by reason of Marshall's and Sutter's claim to the site. There stood the sawmill unfinished, the dam and tail race just as they were left when the Mormons ceased work. Marshall and Wimmer's family of wife and half a dozen children were there, guarding their supposed treasure, living in a house made of clapboards. Here also we were shown many specimens of gold, of a coarser grain than that found at Mormon Island. The next day we crossed the American River to its north side, and visited many small camps of men, in what we called the dry diggings. Little pools of water stood in the beds of the streams, and these were used to wash the dirt, and there the gold was in every conceivable shape and size, some of the specimens weighing several ounces. Some of these diggings were extremely rich, but as a whole they were more precarious in results than at the river. Sometimes a lucky fellow would hit a pocket and collect several $1,000s in a few days, and then again he would be shifting about from place to place, prospecting, and spending all he had made. Little stores were being opened at every point, where flour, bacon, etc. were sold, everything being $1 a pound, and a meal usually costing $3. Nobody paid for a bed, for he slept on the ground without fear of cold or rain. We spent nearly a week in that region, and were quite bewildered by the fabulous tales of recent discoveries, which at the time were confined to the several forks of the American and Yuba rivers. All this time our horses had nothing to eat but the sparse grass in that region, and we were forced to work our way down toward Sacramento Valley, or to see our animals perish. Still we contemplated a visit to the Yuba and Feather rivers, from which we had heard of more wonderful diggings, but met a courier who announced that the arrival of a ship at Monterey with dispatches of great importance from Mazatlan. We accordingly turned our horses back to Sutter's Fort, crossing the Sacramento again by swimming our horses, and ferrying their loads in the solitary canoe. We took our back track as far as the Napa, and then turned to Benicia, on Carquinez Straits. We found there a solitary adobe house occupied by Mr. Hastings and his family, embracing Dr. Semple, the proprietor of the ferry. This ferry was a ship's boat, with a latten sail, which could carry across at one tide 6 or 8 horses. It took us several days to cross over, and during that time we got well acquainted with the doctor, who was quite a character. He had come to California from Illinois, and was brother to Senator Semple. He was about 7 feet high and very intelligent. When we first reached Monterey, he had a printing press, which belonged to the United States, having been captured at the custom house, and had been used to print custom house blanks. With this, Dr. Semple, as editor, published the Californian, a small sheet of news once a week, and it was a curiosity in its line, using 2 V's for a W, and other combinations of letters, made necessary by want of type. After some time he removed to Yerba Buena with his paper, and grew it up to be the Alta California of today, foreseeing, as he thought, the growth of a great city somewhere on the bay of San Francisco. He selected Carquinez Straits as its location, and obtained from General Vallejo a title to a league of land, on condition of building up a city thereon to bear the name of Vallejo's wife. This was Francisca Venecia. Accordingly, the new city was named Francisca. At this time, the town near the mouth of the bay was known universally as Yerba Buena, but that name was not known abroad, although San Francisco was familiar to the whole civilized world. Now some of the chief men of Yerba Buena, Folsom, Howard, Leidesdorf, and others, knowing the importance of a name, saw their danger, and, by some action of the Ayuntamiento, or town council, changed the name of Yerba Buena to San Francisco. Dr. Semple was outraged at their changing the name to one so like his of Francisca, and he in turn changed his town to the other name of Mrs. Vallejo, viz. Benicia, and Benicia it has remained to this day. I am convinced that this little circumstance was big with consequences. That Benicia had the best natural site for a commercial city, I am satisfied, and had half the money and half the labor since bestowed upon San Francisco been expended at Benicia. We should have at this day a city of palaces on the Carquinez Straits. The name of San Francisco, however, fixed the city where it now is, for every ship in 1848-49 which cleared from any part of the world knew the name of San Francisco, but not Yerba Buena or Benicia, and accordingly ships consigned to California came pouring in with their contents, and were anchored in front of Yerba Buena, the first town. Captains and crews deserted for the gold mines, and now half the city in front of Montgomery Street is built over the hulks thus abandoned. But Dr. Semple at that time was all there was of Benicia. He was captain and crew of his ferry boat, and managed to pass our party to the south side of the Carquinez Straits in about 2 days. Thence we proceeded up Amador Valley to Alameda Creek, and so on to the old mission of San Jose, thence to the pueblo of San Jose, where Folsom and those belonging to Yerba Buena went in that direction, and we continued on to Monterey, our party all the way giving official sanction to the news from the gold mines and adding new force to the fever. On reaching Monterey, we found dispatches from Commodore Shubrick at Mazatlan, which gave almost positive assurance that the war with Mexico was over, that hostilities had ceased, and commissioners were arranging the terms of peace at Guadalupe Hidalgo. It was well that this news reached California at the critical time, for so contagious had become the gold fever that everybody was bound to go and try his fortune, and the volunteer regiment of Stevenson's would have deserted in mass, had the men not been assured that they would very soon be entitled to an honorable discharge. Many of our regulars did desert, among them the very men who had escorted us faithfully to the mines and back. Our servants also left us, and nothing less than $300 a month would hire a man in California. Colonel Mason's black boy, Aaron, alone of all our then servants proving faithful, we were forced to resort to all manner of shifts to live. At first we had a mess with a black fellow we called Butamente as cook, but he got the fever and had to go. We next took a soldier, but he deserted and carried off my double-barrel shotgun, which I prized very highly. To meet this condition of facts, Colonel Mason ordered that liberal furloughs should be given to the soldiers, and promises to all in turn, and he allowed all the officers to draw their rations in kind. As the actual value of the ration was very large, this enabled us to live. Halleck, Murray, Ord, and I boarded with Donna Augustius, and turned in our rations as pay for our board. Sometime in September 1848, the official news of the Treaty of Peace reached us, and the Mexican War was over. This treaty was signed in May, and come to us all the way by land by a courier from Lower California, sent from La Paz by Lieutenant Colonel Burton. On its receipt, orders were at once made for the muster out of all of Stevenson's regiment, and our military forces were thus reduced to the single company of dragoons at Los Angeles, and the one company of artillery at Monterey. Nearly all business had ceased except that connected with gold, and during that fall Colonel Mason, Captain Warner, and I made another trip up to Sutter's Fort, going also to the newly discovered mines on the Stanislaus, called Sonora, named from the miners of Sonora, Mexico, who had first discovered them. We found there pretty much the same state of facts as before existed at Mormon Island and Coloma, and we daily received intelligence of the opening of still other mines north and south. But I have passed over a very interesting fact. As soon as we had returned from our visit to the gold mines, it became important to send home positive knowledge of this valuable discovery. The means of communication with the United States were very precarious, and I suggested to Colonel Mason that a special courier ought to be sent, that Second Lieutenant Loser had been promoted to First Lieutenant and was entitled to go home. He was accordingly detailed to carry the news. I prepared with great care the letter to the Adjutant General of August 17, 1848, which Colonel Mason modified in a few particulars, and, as it was important to send not only the specimens which had been presented to us along our route of travel, I advised the Colonel to allow Captain Folsom to purchase and send to Washington a large sample of the commercial gold in general use, and to pay for the same out of the money in his hands known as the Civil Fund, arising from the duties collected at the several ports in California. He consented to this, and Captain Folsom bought an oyster can full at $10 the ounce, which was the rate of value at which it was then received at the custom house. Folsom was instructed further to contract with some vessel to carry the messenger to South America, where he could take the English steamers as far east as Jamaica, with the conditional charter giving increased payment if the vessel could catch the October steamer. Folsom chartered the bark La Lambeacana, owned and navigated by Henry D. Cook, who has since been the governor of the District of Columbia. In due time this vessel reached Monterey, and Lieutenant Loser, with his report and specimens of gold, embarked and sailed. He reached the South American continent at Paeta, Peru, in time, took the English steamer of October to Panama, and thence went on to Kingston, Jamaica, where he found a sailing vessel bound for New Orleans. On reaching New Orleans, he telegraphed to the War Department his arrival, but so many delays had occurred that he did not reach Washington in time to have the matter embraced in the President's regular message of 1848, as we had calculated. Still, the President made it to the subject of a special message, and thus became official what had before only reached the world in a very indefinite shape. Then began the wonderful development, and the great emigration to California by land and by sea of 1849 and 1850. As before narrated, Mason, Warner, and I made a second visit to the mines in September and October 1848. As the winter season approached, Colonel Mason returned to Monterey, and I remained for a time at Sutter's Fort, in order to share somewhat in the riches of the land. We formed a partnership in a store at Coloma, in charge of Norman S. Bester, who had been Warner's clerk. We supplied the necessary money, $1,500, $500 each, and Bester carried on the store at Coloma for his share. Out of this investment, each of us realized a profit of about $1,500. Warner also got a regular leave of absence, and contracted with Captain Sutter for surveying and locating the town of Sacramento. He received for this $16 per day for his services as a surveyor, and Sutter paid all the hands engaged in the work. The town was laid off mostly up about the fort, but a few streets were staked off along the river bank, and one or two leading to it. Captain Sutter always contended, however, that no town could possibly exist on the immediate bank of the river, because the spring freshets rose over the bank, and frequently it was necessary to swim a horse to reach the boat landing. Nevertheless, from the very beginning the town began to be built on the very river bank via 1st, 2nd, and 3rd streets, with J and K streets leading back. Among the principal merchants, the traders of that winter at Sacramento, were Sam Brannan and Hansley Reading and Co. For several years the site was annually flooded, but the people have persevered in building the levees, and afterward in raising all the streets, so that Sacramento is now a fine city, the capital of the state, and stands where, in 1848, was nothing but a dense mass of bushes, vines, and submerged land. The old fort has disappeared altogether. During the fall of 1848, Warner, Ord, and I camped on the bank of the American River, abreast of the fort, at what was known as the Old Tan Yard. I was cook, Ord cleaned up the dishes, and Warner looked after the horses. but Ord was deposed as Scallion because he would only wipe the tin plates with the tuft of grass, according to the custom of the country, whereas Warner insisted on having them washed after each meal with hot water. Warner was in consequence promoted to scullion, and Ord became the hostler. We drew our rations in kind from the commissary at San Francisco, who sent them up to us by a boat, and we were thus enabled to dispense a generous hospitality to many a poor devil who otherwise would have had nothing to eat. The winter of 1848-49 was a period of intense activity throughout California. The rainy season was unfavorable to operations of gold mining, and was very hard upon the thousands of houseless men and women who dwelt in the mountains, and even in the towns. Most of the natives and old inhabitants had returned to their ranches and houses, yet there were not roofs enough in the country to shelter the thousands who had arrived by sea and by land. The news had gone forth to the whole civilized world that gold in fabulous quantities was to be had for the mere digging, and adventurers came pouring in blindly to seek their fortunes, without a thought of house or food. Yerba Buena had been converted into San Francisco, Sacramento City had been laid out, lots were being rapidly sold, and the town was being built up as an entrepot to the mines. Stockton has also been chosen as a convenient point for trading with the lower or southern mines. Captain Sutter was the sole proprietor of the former, and Captain Charles Weber was the owner of the site of Stockton, which was as yet known as French Camp. Chapter 3. Early Recollections of California, continued, 1849 to 1850. The department headquarters still remained at Monterey, but, with the few soldiers, we had next to nothing to do. In midwinter we heard the approach of a battalion of the 2nd Dragoons under Major Lawrence Pike Graham, with Captains Rutger, Kautz, Campbell, and others along. So exhausted were they by their long march from Upper Mexico that we had to send relief to meet them as they approached. When this command reached Los Angeles, it was left there as the garrison, and Captain A.J. Smith's company of the 1st Dragoons was brought up to San Francisco. We were also advised that the 2nd Infantry, Colonel B. Riley, would be sent out around Cape Horn in sailing ships, that the Mounted Rifles, under Lieutenant Colonel Loring, would march overland to Oregon, and that Brigadier General Percifer F. Smith would come out in chief command of the Pacific coast. It was also known that a contract had been entered into with parties in New York and New Orleans for a monthly line of steamers from those cities to California via Panama. Lieutenant Colonel Burton had come up from Lower California, and, as captain of the 3rd Artillery, he was assigned to Company F, 3rd Artillery, at Monterey. Captain Warner remained at Sacramento, surveying, and Halleck, Murray, Ord, and I boarded with Donna Augustias. The season was unusually rainy and severe, but we passed the time with the usual round of dances and parties. The time fixed for the arrival of the mail steamer was understood to be about January 1st, 1849, but the day came and went without any tidings of her. Orders were given to Captain Burton to announce her arrival by firing a national salute, and each morning we listened for the guns from the fort. The month of January passed, and the greater part of February, too. As was usual, the army officers celebrated the 22nd of February with a grand ball given in the new stone schoolhouse, which Alcalde Walter Colton had built. It was the largest and best hall then in California. The ball was really a handsome affair, and we kept it up nearly all night. The next morning we were at breakfast, present Donna Augustias and Manuelita, Halleck, Murray, and myself. We were dull and stupid enough until a gun from the fort aroused us. Then another and another. "The steamer!" exclaimed all, and without waiting for hats or anything, off we dashed. I reached the wharf hatless, but the Donna sent my cap after me by a servant. The white puffs of smoke hung around the fort, mingled with the dense fog, which hid all the water of the bay, and well out to sea could be seen the black spars of some unknown vessel. At the wharf I found a group of soldiers and a small rowboat, which belonged to a brig at anchor in the bay. Hastily ordering a couple of willing soldiers to get in and take the oars, and Mr. Larkin and Mr. Hartnell asking to go along, we jumped in and pushed off, steering our boat toward the spars, which loomed up above the fog clear and distinct. In about a mile we came to the black hull of the strange monster, the long-expected and most welcome steamer California. Her wheels were barely moving, for her pilot could not see the shoreline distinctly, though the hills and point of pines could be clearly made out over the fog, and occasionally a glimpse of some white walls showed where the town lay. A Jacob's ladder was lowered for us from the steamer, and in a minute I scrambled up on deck, followed by Larkin and Hartnell, and we found ourselves in the midst of many old friends. There was Canby, the adjutant general, who was to take my place, Charlie Hoyt, my cousin, General Percifer F. Smith and wife, Gibbs, his aide-de-camp, Major Ogden, of the engineers, and wife, and indeed many old Californians, among them Alfred Robinson and Frank Ward, with his pretty bride. By the time the ship was fairly at anchor, we had answered a million of questions about gold and the state of the country, and, learning that the ship was out of fuel, had informed the captain, Marshall, that there was an abundance of pine wood, but no willing hands to cut it, that no man could be hired at less than an ounce of gold a day, unless the soldiers would volunteer to do it for some agreed-upon price. As for coal, there was not a pound in Monterey, or anywhere else in California. Vessels with coal were known to be en route around Cape Horn, but none had yet reached California. The arrival of this steamer was the beginning of a new epoch on the Pacific coast. Yet there she lay, helpless, without coal or fuel. The native Californians, who had never seen a steamship, stood for days on the beach looking at her, with the universal exclamation, "Tan feo!" How ugly! And she was truly ugly when compared with the clean, well-sparred frigates and sloop-of-wars that had hitherto been seen on the North Pacific coast. It was first supposed it would take 10 days to get wood enough to prosecute her voyage, and therefore all the passengers who could take up their quarters on shore. Major Canby relieved me, and took the place I had held so long as Adjutant General of the Department of California. The time seemed most opportune for me to leave the service, as I had several splendid offers of employment and of partnership, and accordingly I made my written resignation, but General Smith put his veto upon it, saying that he was to command the Division of the Pacific, while General Riley was to have the Department of California, and Colonel Loring that of Oregon. He wanted me as his adjutant general, because of my familiarity with the country, and knowledge of its then condition. At the time, he had on his staff Gibbs as his aide-de-camp, and Fitzgerald as quartermaster. He also had along with him quite a retinue of servants, hired with a clear contract to serve for a whole year after reaching California, every one of whom deserted, except a young black fellow named Isaac. Mrs. Smith, a pleasant but delicate Louisiana lady, had a white maid-servant, in whose fidelity she had unbounded confidence. But this girl was married to a perfect stranger, and off before she had ever landed in San Francisco. It was therefore finally arranged that, on the California, I was to accompany General Smith to San Francisco as his adjutant general. I accordingly sold some of my horses, and arranged for others to go up by land, and from that time I became fairly enlisted in the military family of General Percifer F. Smith. I parted with my old commander, Colonel Mason, with sincere regret. To me he had ever been kind and considerate, and, while stern, honest to a fault. He was the very embodiment of the principle of fidelity to the interests of the general government. He possessed a native strong intellect, and far more knowledge of the principles of civil government and law than he got credit for. In private and public expenditures he was extremely economical, but not penurious. In cases where the officers had to contribute money for parties and entertainments, he always gave a double share, because of his allowance of double rations. During our frequent journeys, I was always caterer, and paid all the bills. In settling with him he required a written statement of the items of account, but never disputed one of them. During our time, California was, as now, full of a bold, enterprising, and speculative set of men who were engaged in every sort of game to make money. I know that Colonel Mason was beset by them to use his position to make a fortune for himself and his friends, but he never bought land or town lots, because, he said, it was his place to hold the public estate for the government as free and unencumbered by claims as possible. And when I wanted him to stop the public land sales in San Francisco, San Jose, etc., he would not. Although he did not believe the titles given by the alcaldes worth a cent, yet they aided to settle the towns and public lands, and he thought, on the whole, the government would be benefited thereby. The same thing occurred as to the gold mines. He never took a title to a town lot, unless it was one, of no real value, from Alcalde Colton, in Monterey, of which I have never heard since. He did take a share in the store which Warner, Bester, and I opened at Coloma, paid his share of the capital $500, and received his share of the profits, $1,500. I think also he took a share in a venture to China with Larkin and others, but on leaving California he was glad to sell out without profit or loss. In the stern discharge of his duty he made some bitter enemies, among them Henry M. Nagley, who, in the newspapers of the day, endeavored to damage his fair fame, but knowing him intimately, I am certain that he is entitled to all praise for having so controlled the affairs of that country that, when his successor arrived, all things were so disposed that a civil form of government was an easy matter of adjustment. Colonel Mason was relieved by General Riley some time in April, and left California in the steamer of the 1st May for Washington and St. Louis, where he died of cholera in the summer of 1850, and his body is buried in Bellefontaine Cemetery. His widow afterward married Major, since General, Don Carlos Buell, and is now living in Kentucky. In overhauling the hold of the steamer California as she lay at anchor in Monterey Bay, a considerable amount of coal was found under some heavy duplicate machinery. With this, and such wood as she had gathered, she was able to renew her voyage. The usual signal was made, and we all went on board. About the 1st of March we entered the Heads, and anchored off San Francisco, near the United States line of battleship Ohio, Commodore T. App Catesby Jones. As was the universal custom of the day, the crew of the California deserted her, and she lay for months unable to make a trip back to Panama, as was expected of her. As soon as we reached San Francisco, the first thing was to secure an office and a house to live in. The weather was rainy and stormy, and snow even lay on the hills back of the mission. Captain Folsom, the quartermaster, agreed to surrender for our office the old adobe custom house on the upper corner of the plaza, as soon as he could remove his papers and effects down to one of his warehouses on the beach. And he also rented for us as quarters the old Hudson Bay Company House on Montgomery Street, which had been used by Howard and Mellis as a store, and at that very time they were moving their goods into a larger brick building just completed for them. As these changes would take some time, General Smith and Colonel Ogden, with their wives, accepted the hospitality offered by Commodore Jones on board the Ohio. I opened the office at the Custom House, and Gibbs, Fitzgerald, and some others of us slept in the loft of the Hudson Bay Company House until the lower part was cleared of Howard's store, after which General Smith and the ladies moved in. There we had a general mess, and the efforts at housekeeping were simply ludicrous. One servant after another, whom General Smith had brought from New Orleans, with a solemn promise to stand by him for 1 whole year, deserted without a word of notice or explanation, and in a few days none remained but little Isaac. The ladies had no maid or attendants, and the general, commanding all the mighty forces of the United States on the Pacific coast, had to scratch to get 1 good meal a day for his family. He was a gentleman of fine social qualities, genial and gentle, and joked at everything. Poor Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Ogden did not bear it so philosophically. Gibbs, Fitzgerald, and I could cruise around and find a meal which cost $3 at some of the many restaurants which had sprung up out of the redwood boards and cotton linens. But the general and ladies could not go out, for ladies were rara avis at that day in California. Isaac was cook, chambermaid, and everything, thoughtless of himself and struggling, out of the slimmest means, to compound a breakfast for a large and hungry family. The breakfast would be announced any time between 10 and 12, and dinner accordingly to circumstances. Many a time have I seen General Smith, with a can of preserved meat in his hands, going toward the house, take off his hat on meeting a negro, and, on being asked the reason of his politeness, he would answer that they were the only real gentlemen in California. I confess that the fidelity of Colonel Mason's boy, Aaron, and of General Smith's boy, Isaac, at a time when every white man laughed at promises as something made to be broken, he had given me a kindly feeling of respect for the Negroes, and makes me hope that they will find an honorable status in the jumble of affairs in which we now live. That was a dull, hard winter in San Francisco. The rains were heavy and the mud fearful. I have seen mules stumble in the street and drown in the liquid mud. Montgomery Street had been filled with brush and clay, and I always dreaded to ride on horseback along it, because the mud was so deep that a horse's leg would become entangled in the bushes below, and the rider was likely to be thrown and drowned in the mud. The only sidewalks were made of stepping stones of empty boxes, and here and there a few planks with barrel staves nailed on. All the town lay along Montgomery Street from Sacramento to Jackson, and about the plaza. Gambling was the chief occupation of the people, while they were waiting for the cessation of the rainy season, and for the beginning of spring. All sorts of houses were being put up, but of the most flimsy kind, and all were stores, restaurants, or gambling saloons. Any room 20 by 60 would rent for $1,000 a month. I had as my pay $70 a month, and no one would even try to hire a servant under $300. Had it not been for the $1,500 I made in the store at Coloma, I could not have lived through the winter. About the 1st of April arrived the steamer Oregon, but her captain, Pearson, knew what was the state of affairs on shore, and ran his steamer alongside the line of battleship Ohio at Sausalito, and obtained the privilege of leaving his crew on board as prisoners until he was ready to return to sea. Then, discharging his prisoners and getting coal out of some of the ships which had arrived, he retook his crew out of limbo and carried the first regular mail back to Panama early in April. In regular order arrived the third steamer, the Panama, and as the vessels were arriving with coal, the California was enabled to hire a crew and get off. From that time forward, these 3 ships constituted the regular line of mail steamers, which has been kept up ever since. By the steamer Oregon arrived out Major R.P. Hammond, J.M. Williams, James Blair, and others. Also the gentlemen who, with Major Ogden, were to compose a joint commission to select the states for the permanent forts and navy yard of California. This commission was composed of Majors Ogden, Smith, and Ledbetter, of the Army, and Captains Goldsborough, Van Brunt, and Blunt, of the Navy. These officers, after a most careful study of the whole subject, selected Mare Island for the navy yard, and Benicia for the storehouses and arsenals of the army. The Pacific Mail Steamship Company also selected Benicia as their depot. Thus was again revived the old struggle for supremacy of these 2 points as the site of the future city of the Pacific. Meantime, however, San Francisco had secured the name. About 600 ships were anchored there without crews and could not get away, and there the city was and had to be. Nevertheless, General Smith, being disinterested and unprejudiced, decided on Benicia as the point where the city ought to be, and where the army headquarters should be. By the Oregon there arrived at San Francisco a man who deserves mention here, Baron Steinberger. He had been a great cattle dealer in the United States, and boasted that he had helped to break the United States Bank by being indebted to it $5 million. At all events, he was a splendid-looking fellow, and brought with him from Washington a letter to General Smith and another for Commodore Jones, to the effect that he was a man of enlarged experience in beef, that the authorities in Washington knew that there existed in California large herds of cattle which were only valuable for their hides and tallow, that it was of great importance to the government that this beef should be cured and salted so as to be of use to the army and navy, obviating the necessity of shipping salt beef around Cape Horn. I know he had such a letter from the Secretary of War, Marcy, to General Smith, for it passed into my custody, and I happened to be in Commodore Jones's cabin when the Baron presented the one for him from the Secretary of the Navy. The Baron was anxious to pitch it at once, and said that all he needed to start with were salt and barrels. After some inquiries of his purser, the Commodore promised to let him have the barrels with their salt, as fast as they were emptied by the crew. Then the Baron explained that he could get a nice lot of cattle from Don Timoteo Murphy, at the mission of San Rafael, on the north side of the bay, but he could not get a boat and crew to handle them. Under the authority from the Secretary of the Navy, the Commodore then promised him the use of a boat and crew, until he, the Baron, could find and purchase a suitable one for himself. Then the Baron opened the first regular butcher shop in San Francisco, on the wharf about the foot of Broadway or Pacific Street, where we could buy at 25 or 50 cents a pound the best roast steaks and cuts of beef, which had cost him nothing, for he never paid anybody if he could help it. And he sooner cleaned poor Don Timoteo out. At first, every boat of his, in coming down from the San Rafael, touched at the Ohio, and left the best beefsteaks and roasts for the Commodore, but soon the Baron had enough money to dispense with the borrowed boat, and set up for himself. And from this small beginning, step by step, he rose in a few months to be one of the richest and most influential men in San Francisco. But in his wild speculations he was at last caught, and became helplessly bankrupt. He followed General Fremont to St. Louis in 1861, where I saw him, but soon afterwards he died a pauper in one of the hospitals. When General Smith had his headquarters in San Francisco in the spring of 1849, Steinberger gave dinners worthy any baron of old, and when, in after years, I was a banker there, he used to borrow of me small sums of money in repayment for my share of these feasts, and somewhere among my old packages I hold one of his confidential notes for $200, but on the whole I got off easy. I have no doubt that, if this man's history could be written out, it would present phases as wonderful as any of romance, but in my judgment he was a dangerous man, without any true sense of honor or honesty. Little by little the rains of that season grew less and less, and the hills once more became green and covered with flowers. It became perfectly evident that no family could live in San Francisco on such a salary as Uncle Sam allowed his most favored officials. So General Smith and Major Ogden concluded to send their families back to the United States, and afterward we menfolks could take to camp and live on our rations. The 2nd Infantry had arrived, and had been distributed, 4 companies to Monterey, and the rest somewhat as Stevenson's regiment had been. A.J. Smith's company of dragoons was sent up to Sonoma, whither General Smith had resolved to move our headquarters. On the steamer which sailed about May 1st, I think the California, we embarked, the ladies for home and we for Monterey. At Monterey we went on shore, and Colonel Mason, who meantime had been relieved by General Riley, went on board, and the steamer departed for Panama. Of all that party, I alone am alive. General Riley had, with his family, taken the house which Colonel Mason had formerly used, and Major Canby and his wife had secured rooms at Alvarado's. Captain Kane was quartermaster, and had his family in the house of a man named Garner, near the redoubt. Burton and Company F were still at the fort. The 4 companies of the 2nd Infantry were quartered in the barracks, the same building in which we had our headquarters, and the company officers were quartered in hired buildings nearby. General Smith and his aide, Captain Gibbs, went to Larkin's house, and I was at my old rooms at Donna Augustias. As we intended to go back to San Francisco by land and afterward to travel a good deal, General Smith gave me the necessary authority to fit out the party. There happened to be several trains of horses and mules in town, so I purchased about a dozen horses and mules at $200 a head, on account of the quartermaster's department, and we had them kept under guard in the quartermaster's corral. I remember one night being in the quarters of Lieutenant Alfred Sully, where nearly all the officers of the garrison were assembled, listening to Sully's stories. Lieutenant Derby, Squeebob, was one of the number, as also Fred Steele, Neighbor Jones, and others, when, just after tattoo, the orderly sergeants came to report the result of tattoo roll call. One reported 5 men absent, another 8, and so on, until it became certain that 28 men had deserted, and they were so bold and open in their behavior that it amounted to defiance. They had deliberately slung their knapsacks and started for the gold mines. Dr. Murray and I were the only ones present who were familiar with the country, and I explained how easy they could all be taken by a party going out at once to Salinas Plain, where the country was so open and level that a rabbit could not cross without being seen, that the deserters could not go to the mines without crossing that plain, and could not reach it before daylight. All agreed that the whole regiment would desert if these men were not brought back. Several officers volunteered on the spot to go after them, and, as the soldiers could not be trusted, it was useless to send any but officers in pursuit. Someone went to report the affair to the Adjutant General, Canby, and he to General Riley. I waited some time, and, as the thing grew cold, I thought it was given up, and went to my room and to bed. About midnight I was called up and informed that there were 7 officers willing to go, but the difficulty was to get horses and saddles. I went down to Larkin's house, and got General Smith to consent that we might take the horses I had bought for our trip. It was nearly 3:00 a.m. before we were all mounted and ready. I had a musket, which I used for hunting. With this I led off at a canter, followed by the others. About 6 miles out, by the faint moon, I saw ahead of us in the sandy road some blue coats, and, fearing lest they might resist or escape into the dense bushes which lined the road, I halted and found with me Paymaster Hill, Captain N.H. Davis, and Lieutenant John Hamilton. We waited for some time for the others, Vi, Canby, Murray, Gibbs, and Sully, to come up, but as they were not in sight we made a dash up the road and captured 6 of the deserters, who were Germans, with heavy knapsacks on, trudging along the deep, sandy road. They had not expected pursuit, had not heard our horses, and were accordingly easily taken. Finding myself the senior officer present, I ordered Lieutenant Hamilton to search the men and then to march them back to Monterey, suspecting, as was the fact, that the rest of our party had taken the road that branched off a couple of miles back. Daylight broke, and we reached the Salinas River, 12 miles out, and there the trail was broad and fresh, leading directly out on the Salinas Plain. This plain is about 5 miles wide, and the ground becomes somewhat broken. The trail continued very plain, and I rode on at a gallop to where there was an old adobe ranch on the left of the road, with the head of a lagoon or pond close by. I saw one or two of the soldiers getting water at the pond, and others up near the house. I had the best horse and was considerably ahead, but on looking back could see Hill and Davis coming up behind at a gallop. I motioned to them to hurry forward, and turned my horse across the head of the pond, knowing the ground well, as it was a favorite place for shooting geese and ducks. Approaching the house, I ordered the men who were outside to go in. They did not know me personally, and exchanged glances, but I had my musket cocked, and, as the two had seen Davis and Hill coming up pretty fast, they obeyed. Dismounting, I found the house full of deserters, and there was no escape for them. They naturally supposed that I had a strong party with me, and when I ordered them to fall in, they obeyed from habit. By the time Hill and Davis came up, I had them formed in 2 ranks, the front rank facing about, and I was taking away their bayonets, pistols, etc. We disarmed them, destroying a musket and several pistols, and, on counting them, we found that we 3 had taken 18, which, added to the 6 first captured, made 24. We made them sling their knapsacks and begin their homeward march. It was near night when we got back, so that these deserters had traveled nearly 40 miles since Tattoo on the night before. The other party had captured 3. So that only 1 man had escaped. I doubt not this prevented the desertion of the bulk of the 2nd Infantry that spring, for at that time so demoralizing was the effect of the gold mines that everybody not in the military service justified desertion, because a soldier, if free, could earn more money in a day than he received per month. Not only did soldiers and sailors desert, but captains and masters of ships actually abandoned their vessels and cargoes to try their luck at the mines. Preachers and professors forgot their creeds and took to trade, and even to keep gambling houses. I remember that one of our regular soldiers, named Reese, in deserting stole a favorite double-barreled shotgun of mine, and when the orderly sergeant of the company Carson was going on furlough, I asked him when he came across Reese to try and get my gun back. When he returned, he told me that he found Reese and offered him $100 for my gun, but Reese sent me word that he liked the gun, and would not take $100 for it. Soldiers or sailors who could reach the mines were universally shielded by the miners, so that it was next to useless to attempt their recapture. In due season, General Percival Smith, Gibbs, and I, with some hired packers, started back for San Francisco, and soon after we transferred our headquarters to Sonoma. About this time Major Joseph Hooker arrived from the east. The regular adjutant general of the division relieved me, and I became thereafter one of General Smith's regular aide-de-camp. As there was very little to do, General Smith encouraged us to go into any business that would enable us to make money. R.P. Hammond, James Blair, and I made a contract to survey for Colonel J.D. Stevenson his newly projected city of New York of the Pacific, situated at the mouth of the San Joaquin River. The contract embraced also the making of soundings and marking out a channel through Suisun Bay. We hired, in San Francisco, a small metallic boat with a sail, laid in some stores, and proceeded to the United States ship Ohio, anchored at Sausalito, where we borrowed a sailor boy and lead lines, with which to sound the channel. We sailed up to Benicia, and at General Smith's request, we surveyed and marked the line dividing the city of Benicia from the government reserve. We then sounded the bay back and forth, and staked out the best channel up Suisun Bay, from which Blair made out sailing directions. We then made the preliminary surveys of the city of New York of the Pacific, all of which were duly plotted, and for this work we each received from Stevenson $500 and 10 or 15 lots. I sold enough lots to make another $500, and let the balance go. For the city of New York of the Pacific never came to anything. Indeed, cities at the time were being projected by speculators all round the bay and all over the country. While we were surveying at New York of the Pacific, occurred one of those little events that showed the force of the gold fever. We had a sailor boy with us, about 17 years old, who cooked our meals and helped work the boat. On shore we had the sail spread so as to shelter us against the wind and dew. One morning I awoke about daylight and looked out to see if our sailor boy was at work getting breakfast. But he was not at the fire at all. Getting up, I discovered that he had converted a tulbosa into a sailboat and was sailing for the gold mines. He was astride this bolsa, with a small parcel of bread and meat done up in a piece of cloth. Another piece of cloth, such as we used for making our signal stations, he had fixed into a sail, and with a paddle he was directing his precarious craft right out into the broad bay, to follow the general direction of the schooners and boats that he knew were ascending the Sacramento River. He was about 100 yards from the shore. I jerked up my gun and hailed him to come back, after a moment's hesitation to let go his sheet, and began to paddle back. This bolsa was nothing but a bundle of tul, or bulrush, bound together with grass ropes in the shape of a cigar, about 10 feet long and about 2 feet through the butt. With these the California Indians crossed streams of considerable size. When he came ashore, I gave him a good overhauling for attempting to desert, and put him to work getting breakfast. In due time we returned him to his ship, the Ohio. Subsequently I made a bargain with Mr. Hartnell to survey his ranch at Cosumnes River, Sacramento Valley. Ord and a young citizen named Seton were associated with me in this. I bought of Rodman and Price a surveyor's compass, chain, etc., and in San Francisco a small wagon and harness. Availing ourselves of a schooner chartered to carry Major Miller and 2 companies of the 2nd Infantry from San Francisco to Stockton, we got up to our destination at little cost. I recall an occurrence that happened when the schooner was anchored in Carquinez Straits, opposite the soldiers' camp on shore. We were waiting for daylight and a fair wind. The schooner lay anchored at an ebb tide, and about daylight Ord and I had gone ashore for something. Just as we were pulling off from shore, we heard the loud shouts of the men, and saw them all running down toward the water. Our attention thus drawn, we saw something swimming in the water, and pulled toward it, thinking it a coyote, but we soon recognized a large grizzly bear, swimming directly across the channel. Not having any weapon, we hurriedly pulled for the schooner, calling out as we neared it, "A bear! A bear!" It soon happened that Major Miller was on deck, washing his face and hands. He ran rapidly to the bow of the vessel, took the musket from the hands of the sentinel, and fired at the bear. As he passed but a short distance ahead of the schooner, the bear rose, made a growl, or howl, but continued his course. As we scrambled up the port side to get our guns, the mate, with a crew, happened to have a boat on the starboard side, and, armed only with a hatchet, they pulled up alongside the bear, and the mate struck him in the head with the hatchet. The bear turned, tried to get into the boat, but the mate struck his claws with repeated blows, and made him let go. After several passes with him, the mate actually killed the bear, got a rope around him, and towed him alongside the schooner, where he was hoisted on deck. The carcass weighed over 600 pounds. It was found that Major Miller's shot had struck the bear in the lower jaw, and thus disabled him. Had it not been for this, the bear would certainly have upset the boat and drowned all in it. As it was, however, his meat served us a good turn in our trip up to Stockton. At Stockton we disembarked our wagon, provisions, and instruments. There I bought 2 fine mules at $300 each, and we hitched and started for the Cosumnes River. About 12 miles off was the McCullamy, a wide, bold stream with a canoe as a ferry boat. We took our wagon to pieces and ferried it and its contents across, and then drove our mules into the water. In crossing, one mule became entangled in the rope of the other, and for a time we thought he was a gone mule. But at last he revived, and we hitched up. The mules were both pack animals. Neither had ever before seen a wagon. Young Seton also was about as green, and had never handled a mule. We put on the harness and began to hitch them in, when one of the mules turned his head, saw the wagon, and started. We held on tight, but the beast did not stop until he had shivered the tongue pole into a dozen fragments. The fact was that Seton had hitched the traces before he had put on the blind bridle. There was considerable swearing done, but that would not mend the pole. There was no place nearer than Sutter's Fort to repair damages, so we were put to our wits' end. We first sent back a mile or so, and bought a rawhide. Gathering up the fragments of the pole and cutting the hide into strips, we fished it in the rudest manner. As long as the hide was green, the pole was very shaky, but gradually the sun dried the hide, tightened it, and the pole actually held for about a month. This cost us nearly a day of delay, but when damages were repaired, we harnessed up again, and reached the crossing of the Cosumnes, where our survey was to begin. The expediente, or title papers, of the ranch described it as containing 9 or 11 leagues on the Cosumnes, south side, and between the San Joaquin River and the Sierra Nevada mountains. We began at the place where the road crosses the Cosumnes and laid down a line 4 miles south, perpendicular to the general direction of the stream. Then, surveying up the stream, we marked each mile so as to admit of a subdivision of 1 mile by 4. The land was dry and very poor, with great bulk of the bottom land occurring on the north side of the stream. We continued the survey up some 20 miles into the hills above the mill of Daler and Sheldon. It took about a month to make this survey, which, when finished, was duly plotted, and for it we received 1/10 of the land, or 2 subdivisions. Ord and I took the land, and we paid Seton for his labor in cash. By the sale of my share of the land, subsequently, I received $300. After finishing Hartnell's survey, we crossed over to Daler's, and did some work for him at $500 a day for the party. Having finished our work on the Cosumnes, we proceeded to Sacramento, where Captain Sutter employed us to connect the survey of Sacramento City made by Lieutenant Warner and that of Sutterville 3 miles below, which was then being surveyed by Lieutenant J.W. Davidson of the 1st Dragoons. At Sutterville, the plateau of the Sacramento approached quite near the river, and it would have made a better site for a town than the low, submerged land where the city now stands. But it seems to be a law of growth that all natural advantages are disregarded wherever one's business chooses a location. Old Sutter's Embarcadero became Sacramento City, simply because it was the first point used for unloading boats for Sutter's Fort, just as the site for San Francisco was fixed by the use of Yerba Buena as the hiding land for the mission of San Francisco de Aziz. I invested my earnings in this survey in 3 lots in Sacramento City, on which I made a fair profit by a sale to one McNulty of Mansfield, Ohio. I only had a 2 months' leave of absence, during which General Smith, his staff, and a retinue of civil friends were making a tour of the gold mines, and hearing that he was en route back to his headquarters at Sonoma, I knocked off my work, sold my instruments, and left my wagon and mules with my cousin Charlie Hoyt, who had a store in Sacramento and was on the point of moving up to a ranch, for which he had bargained, on Bear Creek, on which was afterward established Camp Far West. He afterward sold the mules, wagon, etc. for me, and on the whole I think I cleared, by those 2 months' work, about $600. I then returned to headquarters at Sonoma, in time to attend my fellow aide-de-camp Gibbs through a long and dangerous sickness, during which he was on board a store ship guarded by Captain George Johnson, who now resides in San Francisco. General Smith had agreed that on the first good opportunity he would send me to the United States as a bearer of dispatches, but this he could not do until he had made the examination of Oregon, which was also in his command. During the summer of 1849 there continued to pour into California a perfect stream of people. Steamers came, and a line was established from San Francisco to Sacramento, of which the senator was the pioneer, charging $16 a passage and actually coining money. Other boats were built, out of the materials which had either come around Cape Horn or were brought from the Sandwich Isles. Wharves were built, houses were springing up as if by magic, and the Bay of San Francisco presented as busy a scene of life as any part of the world. Major Allen, of the quartermaster's department, who had come out as chief quartermaster of the division, was building a large warehouse at Benicia, with a row of quarters out of lumber at $100 per 1,000 feet, and the work was done by men at $16 a day. I have seen a detailed soldier, who got only his monthly pay of $8 a month and 20 cents a day for extra duty, nailing on weatherboards and shingles alongside a citizen who was paid $16 a day. This was a real injustice, made the soldiers discontented, and it was hardly to be wondered at that so many deserted, while the mass of people were busy at gold and in mammoth speculations. A set of busy politicians were at work to secure the prizes of civil government. Gwynn and Fremont were there, and T. Butler King, of Georgia, had come out from the East, scheming for office. He stayed with us at Sonoma, and was generally regarded as the government candidate for the United States Senator. General Riley as governor and Captain Halleck as Secretary of State had issued a proclamation for the election of a convention to frame a state constitution. In due time the elections were held, and the convention was assembled at Monterey. Dr. Semple was elected president, and Gwynn, Sutter, Halleck, Butler, King, Sherwood, Gilbert, Shannon, and others were members. General Smith took no part in this convention, but sent me down to watch the proceedings and report to him. The only subject of interest was the slavery question. There was no slaves then in California, save a few who had come out as servants, but the Southern people at that time claimed their share of the territory out of that acquired by the common laborers of all sections of the Union in the war with Mexico. Still, in California there was little feeling on the subject. I never heard General Smith, who was a Louisian, express any opinion about it, nor did Butler King of Georgia ever manifest any particular interest in the matter. A committee was named to draft a constitution which in due time was reported, with the usual clause, then known as the Wilmot Proviso, excluding slavery, and during the debate which ensued very little opposition was made to this clause, which was finally adopted by a large majority, although the convention was made up in large part of men from our southern states. This matter of California being a free state afterward, in the National Congress, gave rise to angry debates, which at one time threatened civil war. The result of the convention was the election of state officers and of the legislation which sat in San Jose in October and November 1849, and which elected Fremont and Gwynn as the first United States Senators in Congress from the Pacific Coast. Shortly after returning from Monterey, I was sent by General Smith up to Sacramento City to instruct Lieutenants Warner and Williamson of the Engineers to push their surveys of the Sierra Nevada mountains for the purpose of ascertaining the possibility of passing that range by a railroad, a subject that then elicited universal interest. It was generally assumed that such a road could not be made along any of the immigrant roads then in use, and Warner's orders were to look farther north up the Feather River or some one of its tributaries. Warner was engaged in this survey during the summer and fall of 1849, and had explored, to the very end of Goose Lake, the source of Feather River. Then, leaving Williamson with the baggage and part of the men, he took about 10 men and a first-rate guide, crossed the summit to the east, and then turned south, having the range of mountains on his right hand, with the intention of regaining his camp by another pass in the mountain. The party was strung out single file, with wide spaces between, Warner ahead. He had crossed a small valley and ascended one of the spurs covered with sagebrush and rocks, when a band of Indians rose up and poured in a shower of arrows. The mule turned and ran back to the valley, where Warner fell off dead, punctured by 5 arrows. The mule also died. The guide, who was next to Warner, was mortally wounded, and 1 or 2 men had arrows in their bodies, but recovered. The party gathered about Warner's body, in sight of the Indians, who whooped and yelled, but did not venture away from their cover of rocks. This party of men remained there all day without burying the dead, and at night, by a wide circuit, passed the mountain, and reached Williamson's camp. The news of Warner's death cast a gloom over all the old Californians, who knew him well. He was a careful, prudent, and honest officer, well qualified for his business, and extremely accurate in all his work. He and I had been intimately associated during our 4 years together in California, and I felt his loss deeply. The season was then too far advanced to attempt to avenge his death, and it was not until the next spring that a party was sent out to gather and bury his scattered bones. As winter approached, the immigrants overland came pouring into California, dusty and worn with their 2,000 miles of weary travel across the plains and mountains. Those who arrived in October and November reported thousands still behind them, with oxen perishing and short of food. Appeals were made for help, and General Smith resolved to attempt relief. Major Rucker, who had come across with Pike Graham's battalion of dragoons, had exchanged with Major Fitzgerald of the Quartermaster's Department, and was detailed to conduct this relief. General Smith ordered him to be supplied with $100,000 out of the civil fund, subject to his control, and with this to purchase at Sacramento flour, bacon, etc., and to hire men and mules to send out and meet the immigrants. Major Rucker fulfilled this duty perfectly, sending out pack trains loaded with food by the many routes by which the immigrants were known to be approaching, went out himself with one of these trains, and remained in the mountains until the last immigrant had got in. No doubt this expedition saved many a life, which has since been most useful to the country. I remained at Sacramento a good part of the fall of 1849, recognizing among the immigrants many of my old personal friends. John C. Fall, William King, Sam Stombaugh, Hugh Ewing, Hampton Denham, etc. I got Rucker to give these last two employment along with the train for the relief of the immigrants. They had proposed to begin a ranch on my land on the Cosumnes, but afterward changed their minds and went out with Rucker. While I was at Sacramento, General Smith had gone on his contemplated trip to Oregon and promised that he would be back in December, when he would send me home with dispatches. Accordingly, as the winter and rainy season was at hand, I went to San Francisco and spent some time at the Presidio, waiting patiently for General Smith's return. About Christmas, a vessel arrived from Oregon with the dispatches and an order for me to deliver them in person to General Winfield Scott in New York City. General Smith had sent them down, remaining in Oregon for a time. Of course, I was already, and others of our set were going home by the same conveyance, viz. Rucker, Ord, A.J. Smith, some under orders and others on leave. Wanting to see my old friends in Monterey, I arranged for my passage in the steamer of January 1st, 1850, paying $600 for passage to New York, and went down to Monterey by land, Rucker accompanying me. The weather was unusually rainy, and all the plain about Santa Clara was under water, but we reached Monterey in time. I again was welcomed by friends, Donna Augustias, Manuelita, and the family, and it was resolved that I should take two of the boys home with me and put them at Georgetown College for education, viz. Antonio and Porfirio, 13 and 11 years old. The Donna gave me a bag of gold dust to pay for their passage and to deposit at the college. On the 2nd day of January, punctually appeared the steamer Oregon. We were all soon on board and off for home. At that time, the steamers touched at San Diego, Acapulco, and Panama. Our passage down the coast was unusually pleasant. Arrived at Panama, we hired mules and rode across the Gorgona, on the Cruces River, where we hired a boat and paddled down to the mouth of the river off which lay the steamer Crescent City. It usually took 4 days to cross the isthmus, every passenger taking care of himself, and it was really funny to watch the efforts of women and men unaccustomed to mules. It was an old song to us, and the trip across was easy and interesting. In due time we were rowed off to the Crescent City, rolling back and forth in the swell, and we scrambled aboard by a Jacob's ladder from the stern. Some of the women had to be hoisted aboard by lowering a tub from the end of a boom. Fun to us who looked on, but awkward enough to the poor women, especially to a very fat one, who attracted much notice. General Fremont, wife, and child, Lily, were passengers with us down from San Francisco, but Mrs. Fremont not being well, they remained over one trip at Panama. Senator Gwynn was one of our passengers, and went through to New York. We reached New York about the close of January, after a safe and pleasant trip. Our party, composed of Ord, A.J. Smith, and Rucker, with the two boys, Antonio and Porfirio, put up at Delmonico's, on Bowling Green, and as soon as we had cleaned up somewhat, I took a carriage, went to General Scott's office in 9th Street, delivered my dispatches, was ordered to dine with him next day, and then went forth to hunt my old friends and relations, the Scotts, Hoyts, etc., etc. On reaching New York, most of us had rough soldiers' clothing, but we soon got a new outfit, and I dined with General Scott's family, Mrs. Scott being present, and also their son-in-law and daughter, Colonel and Mrs. H.L. Scott. The general questioned me pretty closely in regard to things on the Pacific coast, especially the politics, and startled me with the assertion that our country was on the eve of a terrible civil war. He interested me by anecdotes of my old army comrades in his recent battles around the city of Mexico, and I felt deeply the fact that our country had passed through a foreign war, that my comrades had fought great battles, and yet I had not heard a hostile shot. Of course, I thought it the last and only chance in my day, and that my career as a soldier was at an end. After some 4 or 5 days spent in New York, I was, by an order of General Scott, sent to Washington to lay before the Secretary of War, Crawford of Georgia, the dispatches which I brought from California. On reaching Washington, I found that Mr. Ewing was Secretary of the Interior, and I at once became a member of his family. The family occupied the house of Mr. Blair, on Pennsylvania Avenue, directly in front of the War Department. I immediately repaired to the War Department, and placed my dispatches in the hands of Mr. Crawford, who questioned me somewhat about California, but seemed a little interested in the subject, except so far as it related to slavery and the routes through Texas. I then went to call on the President at the White House. I found Major Bliss, who had been my teacher in mathematics at West Point, and was then General Taylor's son-in-law and private secretary. He took me into the room, now used by the President's private secretaries, where President Taylor was. I had not seen him before, though I had served under him in Florida in 1840-41, and was most agreeably surprised at his fine personal appearance, and his pleasant, easy manners. He received me with great kindness, told me that Colonel Mason had mentioned my name with praise, and that he would be pleased to do me any act of favor. We were with him nearly an hour, talking about California generally, and of his personal friends, Percifer Smith, Riley, Canby, and others. Although General Scott was generally regarded by the army as the most accomplished soldier of the Mexican War, yet General Taylor had that blunt, honest, and stern character that endeared him to the masses of the people and made him president. Bliss, too, had gained a large fame by his marked skill and intelligence as an adjutant general and military adviser. His manner was very unmilitary, and in his talk he stammered and hesitated, so as to make an unfavorable impression on a stranger, but he was wonderfully accurate and skillful with his pen, and his orders and letters form a model of military precision and clearness.